Hey there, and welcome back. Whatever the day has asked of you, it is finished now, and there is nothing left to do but lay it down and let yourself grow heavy and still. So settle into the warmth, let your breathing slow, and let me carry you a long way off, more than 5 centuries back, into the life of a woman who stood at the very heart of the bloodiest family quarrel in English history and somehow outlasted them all. Tonight our subject is a woman who was the wife of a man who almost became king and the mother of 2 men who did. She watched her husband killed in battle, saw one son crowned, and then another, saw one of her boys put to death on the order of his own brother, and lived long enough to see the whole proud dynasty she had built torn down and replaced. Through all of it, she kept her head, her dignity, and most of her secrets. Her name was Cecily Neville, and by the end of her life, she had been called the Rose of Raby for her beauty and Proud Cis for her temper. And she had buried very nearly everyone she loved. And there is one question that has hung over her memory for 500 years, a question about what she knew and what she may have done, in the darkest hour of her family's story. A question we will come to in time, when the night is older. Before we go on, a small and gentle thing. There is a quiet pleasure for me in knowing who has joined me in the dark tonight. So if the mood takes you, drop a line below and tell me which corner of the earth you are resting in, and how late it has grown there. I do read through them, and something about it warms me. The thought of so many distant rooms, all turned toward one old tale as the night deepens. And should these unhurried wanderings through the past be something you would care to have more of, the way to find them again is simply to subscribe, with no pressure in it whatsoever, so that the next of these evenings will reach you in its own good time. That is all that needed saying. From here on, the night is hers. Picture this. A vast fortress rising grey out of the green country of the far north of England, its towers blunt against a wide and changing sky. The wind off the moors moving steadily through the cold stone halls. This is Raby Castle, in the county of Durham, one of the mightiest strongholds in the north. And on a spring day in the year 1415, in a chamber high within its walls, a daughter is born to the mightiest house in the region. Outside, the deer move across the broad park that surrounds the castle. Within, the household of a vast and ambitious noble house goes about its work, and a new child is added to an already enormous brood. No one watching that day could have known that this particular infant, the youngest daughter of the house, would live to be the grandmother of kings and queens, the matriarch of a line that would rule England for 100 years and more. For now, she is simply the latest Rose of Raby, born into wealth and power, and the hard, beautiful country of the north, at the very beginning of a century that would test her family and her almost past bearing. Linger a moment on the temper of that northern country, for it shaped the people as much as the place. In the far north, the king's authority ran thin, and the foremost families governed almost as princes in their own lands, settling their quarrels by their own strength, and bowing to no power they could not see. It was a society that prized self-reliance, that expected a family to defend its own rights and avenge its own wrongs, that measured a house by the men it could put in the field and the loyalty it could command. The people it bred were hard, proud, and watchful, accustomed to a world in which weakness invited destruction and only strength was respected. To be raised among them was to absorb a particular cast of mind, a keen sense of one's own consequence, a readiness to stand on one's rights, a steel beneath the courtesy. Cecily carried that northern temper to the end of her days, and those who later found her proud and unbending were meeting, in part, a daughter of the marches, formed in a country where pride was not a vice, but a form of survival. The Rose of Raby was a northern rose, and the north had thorns. The country into which she was born has much to do with the woman she became, and it is worth lingering on. The north of England in the 15th century was a hard and a separate place, far from the soft southern shires and farther still from the bustle of London, a land of high moors and deep dales, of long winters and short-growing seasons, of scattered villages clinging to the valleys beneath the looming grey fortresses of the lords who ruled them. It bred a tougher kind of nobility than the south. Men and women shaped by the border with Scotland, where raiding and feud and the sudden violence of the frontier were facts of ordinary life. To hold land in the north was to hold it with a strong hand or not at all, and the families who flourished there were those who could raise armed men, command loyalty, and defend what was theirs. Raby Castle itself, where Cecily was born, was no soft manor house, but a true stronghold, built to withstand siege, its hall capable of feasting hundreds, its towers watching the country for miles around. This was the world that formed her earliest years, a world of power held through strength, of family loyalty as the first law of survival, of a hard northern pride that she would carry, unmistakably, to the end of her life. The girl who would one day be called Proud Cis came by her pride, honestly. She was born to it, in a fortress on the edge of a wild country, into a family that bowed to almost no one. We can fill in something of what her childhood would have been, even though the records say almost nothing of it directly, for the upbringing of a nobleman's daughter followed well-worn lines. From her earliest years, she would have been trained from childhood in the running of a noble household, learning at her mother's side the management of the stores and the servants, the brewing and baking and preserving, the care of the sick and the dispensing of charity at the gate, the whole intricate economy of an establishment that a lady would one day be expected to command. She would have learned to read, certainly, for piety required it, and her later love of books shows she learned it well. She may have had a little Latin for her devotions, and the French that was still the language of courtesy among the high nobility. She would have been taught the needlework and the music and the dancing that adorned a well-bred young woman, and above all the bearing and the courtesy and the dignity of manner that marked a lady of rank. And she would have absorbed, without anyone needing to teach it in words, the central facts of her position, that she was a Neville, that her family stood near the summit of the kingdom, and that her own chief purpose would be the marriage her parents would one day arrange to extend the family's reach. It was an education aimed at a particular destiny, and Cecily, by the evidence of all she became, learned every lesson of it well. For the house she was born into was at that moment very nearly the mightiest in the whole of the north of England. The Nevilles had risen over generations from solid northern gentry into the front rank of the English nobility, accumulating lands, titles, and marriages until their power stretched across vast tracts of the country and their name commanded armies. Cecily's father was Ralph Neville, the first Earl of Westmoreland, a shrewd and formidable magnate who had backed the right side in the dynastic upheavals of his own day and been richly rewarded for it. He had served the crown, married twice and well, and built the Neville interest into a power that few in England could match. By the time Cecily was born, her father stood among the mightiest men in the land, the master of a sprawling affinity of retainers and tenants and allies who would answer his summons, the head of a house on the rise. To be born a Neville in those years was to be born into the very heart of English aristocratic power, with all the wealth and connection and expectation that came with it. And it meant being born into an enormous brood, for Ralph Neville was a man of many children, and the household she entered teemed with brothers and sisters and half-siblings. A sprawling clan, whose members would marry into the greatest houses of the kingdom and seed the upper nobility of England, with Neville blood. That web of marriages was the true engine of the family's strength, and Cecily was from birth a piece on the board. A noble house in that age advanced itself above all through the marriages of its children, binding itself to other powerful houses, extending its reach into new regions, and weaving a net of alliances and obligations that multiplied its reach. Ralph Neville was a master of this game. He married his many sons and daughters into the foremost families of the land with such success that in time the Nevilles were connected by blood or marriage to a remarkable share of the English nobility. Cecily's brothers and sisters and half-siblings became earls and countesses, the heads and consorts of foremost houses, and through them the Neville influence spread ever wider. A daughter of such a family was raised in the clear knowledge that her own marriage would one day be arranged for the good of the house, that her hand was an asset to be deployed, and that the match made for her would be among the most important decisions of her life, settled by her parents with an eye to the family's advantage rather than to her own preference. None of this was thought cruel or unusual. It was simply how the world worked for women of her rank, and she would have understood it from her earliest years. She was a Neville, and being a Neville meant that her destiny would be shaped by the needs of the house into which she had been born, a line climbing, marriage by marriage, toward the very summit of the kingdom. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of that Neville web, for it would shape the whole course of Cecily's life and the wars to come. Her father's many children, by 2 marriages, were placed with such skill that the Nevilles came to be linked by blood to a remarkable share of the English nobility, an interconnected cousinhood spread across the foremost houses of the land. One marriage in particular would matter beyond all the others. Cecily's brother Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, was the father of another Richard Neville, who through his own marriage became Earl of Warwick, remembered ever after by the title of Kingmaker, the mightiest subject of his age, who would make and unmake kings, and tower over the reign of Cecily's son. Warwick was Cecily's nephew, and the bond between the houses of York and Neville, sealed by Cecily's own marriage and reinforced by a web of further connections, was for years the central alliance of the Yorkist cause. The Nevilles and the Yorks rose together, the family of the Duchess lending its vast power to the ambitions of the Duke. But the same web that bound them could also, when loyalties frayed, turn one part of the family against another, and in time the Kingmaker would make war on the very house his aunt had married into. The Neville connection was the great strength of the Yorkist cause, and in the end one of its gravest dangers, and Cecily stood at the very heart of it, a Neville by birth and a York by marriage, kin to both sides of a quarrel that would one day tear her family apart. If her father gave Cecily the hard pride of the North, it was her mother who gave her something rarer, and in the long run, more dangerous, a strain of royal blood. Cecily's mother was Joan Beaufort, and Joan was no ordinary noblewoman. She was the daughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the most powerful prince of his generation, a son of King Edward III and the brother of kings. That alone would have made Cecily's maternal descent grand enough. But the particular nature of that descent gave it a special and complicated flavour, for Joan Beaufort and her siblings had been born to John of Gaunt, not by either of his wives, but by his long-time mistress, Catherine Swynford, the woman he loved across the whole of his life and married only at its end. The Beaufort children, born outside wedlock and only later made legitimate by Act of Parliament and papal blessing, carried the blood of kings in their veins, along with the faint, ineradicable shadow of their illegitimate origin. They were royal, and they knew it. They bore a version of the royal arms and married into the highest ranks, but there clung to them always a whisper of the bar sinister, a question mark that their enemies could exploit and that their own pride could never quite dissolve. This was the inheritance Cecily drew from her mother, and it shaped her in ways both obvious and subtle. Through Joan Beaufort, she was a great-granddaughter of Edward III, a descendant of the royal house of England, with a claim to kinship with the reigning Lancastrian kings who sat on the throne in her youth. The blood of Gaunt ran in her, and she carried it with the conscious pride of one who knew exactly how grand her ancestry was. It is not hard to trace, in the woman who would later use near-royal styles and bridle at any slight to her dignity, the granddaughter of a royal duke who had been taught from the cradle that she was of the blood of kings. But the Beaufort descent carried a further, stranger significance that would only become clear much later in her life. For the legitimized, but once illegitimate Beauforts embodied a truth that the whole coming age would turn upon, that the line between legitimate and illegitimate, between the rightful heir and the barred one, was not always fixed and certain, but could be argued, challenged, made and unmade by those with the power to do so. She was born of a family that had crossed that line in one direction, from bastardy to legitimacy. She would live to see the same terrible question: who is legitimate, who has the right, whose birth bars them from the throne, tear her own children's world to pieces. The name Beaufort itself would echo through the wars in ways that bound Cecily's story to the whole tragic age. Her Beaufort kin, the legitimized descendants of John of Gaunt, were among the staunchest supporters of the Lancastrian crown, and one branch of them would produce, in time, a figure whose destiny would intertwine with Cecily's own family in the final act of the drama. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, whose son would defeat Cecily's son Richard at Bosworth and marry Cecily's granddaughter to found the Tudor line. The two women, Cecily Neville and Margaret Beaufort, were distant kin through the Beaufort blood they shared, and they stood, in the end, on opposite sides of the last long struggle, the one the matriarch of York, the other the matriarch of the rising Tudor cause. That the blood of John of Gaunt should run in both of them, and that their descendants should be joined at the last in the marriage that ended the wars, is one of those knots of kinship and destiny in which the whole period abounds. Cecily's Beaufort inheritance was not merely a matter of grand ancestry. It placed her within the dense web of royal and noble blood, whose tangled loyalties and rivalries made up the very substance of the wars. She was connected by that blood to nearly every real player in the drama, kin to enemies and allies alike, bound into the family quarrel that was the age itself. To be a Beaufort granddaughter was to stand near the centre of everything, and she did, from her birth to her death, and through her descendants long after. There was, too, a particular irony folded into her Beaufort blood that the years would slowly unfold. The Beauforts were a Lancastrian family, the half-royal kin of the Lancastrian kings, bound by blood and loyalty and interest to the House of Lancaster that ruled England in Cecily's youth. Her own mother's people stood at the heart of the Lancastrian establishment, and yet Cecily would marry into the rival house, the House of York, and would become in time the matriarch of the Yorkist cause, the mother of the Yorkist kings who would destroy the Lancastrian dynasty her own Beaufort kin had served. The blood of Lancaster, running in her veins, would help to make her son's claim to the throne, for their royal descent came in significant part through her. She was the bridge by which the blood of John of Gaunt flowed into the House of York and armed it for the struggle against Gaunt's own Lancastrian heirs. It was a knot of loyalty and lineage of the kind that the whole period would tie and untie in blood cousins against cousins. The same royal blood on both sides of every battlefield. Families divided against themselves by the accident of which branch of the royal tree they had married into. She, Neville, carried that division within her own person from the moment of her birth, the daughter of the North and the granddaughter of Gaunt. Lancastrian by blood and Yorkist by destiny, a woman in whom the central quarrel of the age was, in a sense, already present and waiting. To understand the wars that would consume Cecily's family, one has to reach back behind her own lifetime to the original wound from which all the bloodshed flowed. 2 generations before she was born, a reigning king of England, Richard II, had been deposed and then quietly murdered by his cousin, who took the throne as Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. It was an usurpation, however, its supporters dressed it, the seizing of a crown that was not rightfully the Caesar's, and it left a poison in the bloodstream of English kingship that would take 100 years to work itself out. For if a king could be deposed and a crown taken by force, then the legitimacy of the line that held it could always be questioned, and other claimants with arguable rights could always be found. Lancaster held the throne through Cecily's youth, but its right rested on that old act of usurpation, and there were those, the House of York chief among them, through its Mortimer descent, who could argue a claim to the crown that was, by the strict logic of inheritance, actually senior to the king's own. This was the buried fault line beneath the politics of Cecily's world, the unresolved question of who truly had the right to rule, and it was into this long quarrel over a contested crown that she married when she became Duchess of York. The conflict that would kill her husband and her sons was not a sudden quarrel, but the working out of a wound nearly a century old, and the blood of both sides of it ran, as we have seen, in Cecily's own veins. The marriage that would shape the whole of Cecily's life was arranged for her when she was still a small child, in the manner of the foremost families of the age. The husband chosen for her was Richard, Duke of York, and he came into the Neville household in an unusual way as her own father's ward. Richard was a boy of tangled and tragic fortunes, but of immense potential value. His father, the Earl of Cambridge, had been executed for treason against the Lancastrian king when Richard was a small child, a stain that might have ruined a lesser inheritance. But through his mother and his uncle, Richard stood to inherit one of the richest combined inheritances of land and title in the whole kingdom, the combined inheritances of the houses of York and Mortimer, which carried with them not only vast wealth, but a claim, through the Mortimer line, to royal descent that some would one day argue was stronger than the reigning king's own. When the boy's wardship fell to Ralph Neville, the canny earl saw at once what a prize he held. A vast inheritance, a royal claim, a boy who would grow into one of the foremost magnates of the kingdom, and he was the earl's to dispose of in marriage. Ralph Neville betrothed this glittering ward to his own youngest daughter, binding the rising Neville family to the ancient and royal House of York, and securing for his little Cecily a husband who might one day stand very near the throne. So Cecily was promised, as a child, to a child, for Richard was only a few years older than she was, and the two were betrothed and then married while both were still very young. With she perhaps no more than 14 at the time, the marriage took full effect. By the custom of the age, a match like this was contracted early, and the young couple often lived apart or only gradually came together as they reached adulthood. But the bond once made was meant to last a lifetime, and this one did. It is one of the quiet wonders of Cecily's story that a marriage arranged by her father for hard dynastic advantage, between two children who had no say in the matter, grew into one of the closest and most enduring partnerships of the entire age. There was nothing inevitable in that. Many such arranged matches settled into cold formality, the husband and wife leading largely separate lives, meeting to produce heirs and otherwise going their own ways. They did not, by every sign the records give us. They became genuinely devoted to one another, companions and partners through more than 30 years, and the strength of that bond would carry them both through the storms that lay ahead. The wardship that brought Richard into the Neville household was itself a revealing feature of the age and worth a moment's explanation. When a great landholder died and left an heir who was yet a child, that heir, along with the management of his vast estates, became a valuable property in the gift of the crown, which could keep the wardship or sell it to whoever would pay. To hold the wardship of a wealthy young heir was to control his lands and revenues during his minority, and crucially, to control his marriage, a right worth a fortune. For the young heir could be married to one's own daughter and his vast inheritance, thereby drawn into one's own family. This was precisely what happened with Richard of York. The crown granted or sold his wardship to Ralph Neville, and Ralph, recognising the prize he held, married the boy to his own daughter Cecily, securing for his family the alliance with one of the grandest inheritances in England. It was a transaction of cold calculation, the disposal of a child's future for the advancement of a family, and it was entirely normal, the kind of arrangement on which the fortunes of foremost houses were built and broken. For Cecily, it meant that her husband was chosen for her in this manner, a ward purchased and bestowed, and that her marriage was, in its origin, a piece of property dealing as much as a union of two people. That it grew into something so much more than that, into the close and devoted partnership it became, is the happy accident at the heart of her story. The warmth that grew, against all the cold calculation, from a match made for gain. The man she was bound to deserves to be known in his own right, for Cecily spent more than 30 years at his side, and her fate was wholly entwined with his. Richard, Duke of York, grew into one of the foremost noblemen of his age, immensely wealthy, royally descended, able, proud, and possessed of a deep and growing sense that he was not given the place his blood and his talents deserved. He was a capable soldier and administrator who served the crown loyally for many years, in France and in Ireland and in the councils of the realm, and who seems genuinely to have seen himself, for most of his life, as the king's faithful subject rather than his rival. But he was also a man with a powerful sense of his own dignity and his own rights, and as the Lancastrian regime grew weak and corrupt around him, that sense curdled slowly into grievance and then into opposition. He believed himself slighted, excluded from the influence his rank entitled him to, his loyal service repaid with suspicion and neglect by a court faction that feared him. Whether he coveted the throne from early on or was driven toward it only gradually by the logic of the conflict is a question that has never been settled, and the truth probably shifted over the years. What is clear is that he was a proud and formidable man who came to feel he had been wronged, and whose response to that feeling would draw the whole kingdom and his own family into war. This was the husband she was given as a child and came to love, the partner of her life and the author, for good and ill, of her family's extraordinary destiny. The claim that Richard of York carried, and that he would pass to his sons, deserves to be set out clearly, for it was the legal heart of the whole Yorkist cause. The reigning Lancastrian kings descended from John of Gaunt, who was the third of Edward III's sons to survive to manhood. But York descended, through his mother's Mortimer line, from Lionel of Antwerp, who had been that same king's second son, to reach manhood an elder branch. By the strict logic of inheritance, a claim through an elder son outranked a claim through a younger, which meant that York's title to the throne could be argued to be actually superior to the reigning king's, the Lancastrians holding the crown only because their ancestor had seized it 3 generations before. This was the explosive proposition that lay coiled at the centre of the wars. So long as it stayed unspoken, the quarrel between York and the court could be contained as a dispute over influence and reform. But the claim was always there, a loaded weapon waiting to be taken up. And when at last York did take it up and assert his right to the throne itself, the conflict was transformed from a struggle over the king's government into a war over the crown. Cecily married into this claim. Her sons inherited it through their father, reinforced by the royal blood she herself brought through her Beaufort descent. The throne that Edward would seize and Richard would take rested on this Mortimer right. The argument that the House of York, not the House of Lancaster, were the true heirs of Edward III. It was a claim worth a kingdom, and it would cost the lives of half of Cecily's family to make good. What makes the closeness of their marriage so striking is how visible it is in the simple pattern of their lives. Richard of York's career took him the length of the kingdom and over the sea to France, to Ireland, to the high offices of state and the battlefields of the gathering civil war. And through almost all of it, Cecily went with him. She was not a wife left behind to manage an estate while her husband ranged the world. She travelled at his side, crossing to Ruan when he governed Lancastrian France, accompanying him to Ireland when he was sent to rule there. sharing the movements and the dangers of his public life to a degree that was unusual even among devoted couples. The children she bore him were born in scattered places through his far-flung career. The geography of their births, a map of the family's restless movement in his service. This was a marriage lived together, not apart. Two people bound not only by the contract their parents had signed, but by a real and lasting attachment. And judged by the hard reckoning a ruling house applied to such things, it was an extraordinarily productive partnership, for she would bear Richard a good many children, securing the future of the House of York with a fertility that must have seemed, to a family obsessed with its bloodline and its claim, like the very blessing of God. The Neville girl and the orphan duke had been joined to serve their family's ambitions. They ended by building, together, a dynasty. The affection between Cecily and her husband is the more remarkable for how rarely the records of the age give us any glimpse of feeling within a noble marriage at all. Marriages among the great were business arrangements, contracted for land and alliance, and the chroniclers who recorded the doings of the mighty seldom troubled to note whether husband and wife loved one another. Such things were private, and beneath the notice of men concerned with war and politics. That we can see, even dimly, the warmth between she and Richard of York is itself a kind of accident, glimpsed through the pattern of their lives rather than stated outright. The constant travelling together, the many children, the partnership maintained across decades and continents, the sense that these two genuinely chose to be in one another's company when they might easily have lived apart. It is a reminder that real human feeling existed within even the most calculated of dynastic marriages, that people in that distant age loved, and were loved much as people are now, however little the records dwell on it. The two were joined for the coldest of reasons, the advancement of two families, and they made of that cold beginning something warm and lasting and real. When he was killed at Wakefield, she did not remarry, though a widow of her rank and wealth would have had no shortage of suitors and no obligation to remain single. She lived out the remaining 35 years of her life as Richard's widow, and was buried beside him at the last. In an age of arranged matches and political marriages, that lifelong fidelity to a husband chosen for her in childhood speaks of a bond that had become, whatever its origins, a genuine and abiding love. Behind the grand title of Duchess lay a deal of hard and unglamorous work, and Cecily, as the partner of one of the realm's foremost magnates, carried her full share of it. A noble estate on the scale of York's was a vast and complex enterprise, a sprawl of manors and castles and lands scattered across many counties, each with its tenants and its officers and its revenues, the whole requiring constant oversight to run profitably and to yield the men and the money on which noble power depended. Much of the management of this enterprise fell to the lady of the house, especially when her lord was away on the king's business, as York so often was. Cecily would have overseen the running of households, the keeping of accounts, the management of servants and officials, the dispensing of hospitality and patronage that bound retainers and allies to the family, and the thousand details of administration that kept a noble establishment functioning. She was, in effect, her husband's deputy and partner in the management of their joint enterprise, trusted to act in his absence and to hold his interests together when he could not be present. This was the ordinary reality behind the romance of a grand medieval marriage. Not idleness and ceremony, but work, responsibility, and the shared labour of maintaining a position at the summit of a demanding world. She was no ornament. She was a working partner in one of the greatest enterprises in the kingdom, and the competence she brought to it was as much a part of her as her pride or her piety. The life she shared with York was, for all its grandeur, a restless and often uncomfortable one, for a noble household in that age was a thing perpetually in motion. A magnate did not stay in one place. He moved among his scattered estates, consuming the produce of each in turn, showing his face to his tenants, dispensing justice and hospitality, and carrying his whole establishment with him as he went. This meant that Cecily's life was lived substantially on the road, her household packed and unpacked, her goods carried in carts over the bad roads of medieval England, her children born in whatever castle or manor the family happened to be occupying when their time came. The geography of her children's births, Ruan, and various English seats, is really the map of this restless movement, the family following the Duke's career and the seasonal round of the estates. There was nothing settled or static about it. A noble lady's life was one of constant travel, constant reorganization, constant adaptation to new surroundings, all conducted with the ceremony and the comfort that her rank demanded even on the move. It was a demanding existence, and it required exactly the qualities Cecily possessed in abundance, competence, resilience, the ability to maintain order and dignity amid perpetual change. She was not a lady of a single fixed and gilded bower, but the mistress of a vast travelling enterprise, and she ran it, year after year, with the steady command that marked everything she did. And yet the children did not come at once, and there were years at the beginning of the marriage when the hoped-for fertility was nowhere in sight. Cecily and Richard were married for some time before their first child arrived, a stretch of barren years that in a dynastic marriage carried a particular and growing anxiety. For a noblewoman of Cecily's rank, the bearing of children, and above all of sons, was not merely a private hope, but the central duty of her position, the very purpose for which the marriage had been made. A ruling house needed heirs to carry its name, its lands, and in York's case, its royal claim into the next generation. A wife who failed to provide them failed at the one task the world held to be most essentially hers. The pressure on a young duchess in those childless early years would have been immense. The whispered question hanging over her of whether she could do the thing she had been married to do. The knowledge that a barren wife was a kind of failure, and even, in the harsh thinking of the age, a possible ground for the setting aside of a marriage. We do not know what she felt in those years, for she left no record of it, but it is not hard to imagine the quiet dread that can attend a long wait for a child when so much depends upon it. The monthly hope and disappointment, the prayers and the pilgrimages, and the slow accumulation of fear. Whatever those early childless years cost her, they ended, and when they ended, the change was overwhelming. Once the children began to come, they came in a flood that more than answered every anxiety of the barren years. Over the course of some 16 years, Cecily bore Richard a good many children, at least a dozen, by the best reckoning, and perhaps 13 in a near continuous sequence of pregnancies that occupied the central decades of her life. It was an astonishing record of childbearing, even by the standards of an age that expected large families, and it speaks to a constitution of remarkable strength. For each pregnancy and each birth carried real danger in a time when bringing a child into the world killed women of every rank with grim regularity. To come through a dozen or more confinements and survive them all, as she did, was itself a kind of triumph, a feat of endurance that the smooth surface of the family tree can make us forget. Behind each name in the long list of her children lay months of pregnancy and the perilous hours of a birth, repeated again and again across the prime of her life. And we should not pass too quickly over the children who did not survive. For behind the bare fact that several of Cecily's babies died young lies a world of grief that the records leave almost entirely unspoken. In an age before any defense against the diseases that carried off the young, even the most privileged children died in heartbreaking numbers, and a mother of Cecily's fertility would have buried several of her babies, some within days of birth, some in early childhood, each loss a private grief absorbed into the relentless round of further pregnancies. We know the names of some of them only from family records, children who lived briefly and died and left scarcely a trace. What it cost Cecily to bear and lose them we can only imagine, for she has left us no lament, no word of her feelings, only the silent evidence of the family tree with its early deaths. But there is no reason to think that mothers of that age loved their children any less, or grieved them any less, than mothers of our own. However practiced they were in loss, and however much the constant presence of death may have armoured them, she would have known the particular sorrow of the small grave, more than once, amid all the other sorrows of her life. It is one more of the quiet burdens she carried, hidden behind the grand public story, the ordinary maternal grief that the chronicles never thought to record, but that was surely as real to her as any of the great dramas of her age. Not all of those children lived, for the age was cruel to the young, and several of Cecily's babies died in infancy or early childhood, as was the common fate of even the most privileged children in a world without defence against the diseases that carried them off. But 7 of her children survived to adulthood, and it is those 7 who would carry her story forward and write their names across the history of England. From the flood of children that followed the barren years came, in time, 2 kings of England, a duchess who would rule in Burgundy, and a line of descent that would flow down through every English monarch who came after. The duchess who had once waited so anxiously for a single child became in the end one of the foremost matriarchs of European royalty, and it is worth knowing each of the 7 in turn, for their destinies are the warp and weft of all that follows. It is worth setting out the 7 who lived, for each would carry a piece of Cecily's story into the future, and their names recur through all that follows. There was Anne, the eldest survivor, who would marry into the high nobility and found a line of her own. There was Edward, born at Ruan, the giant and the soldier, who would seize the throne and reign as Edward IV. There was Edmund, the second son, grave and promising, who would die at 17 beside his father in the snow at Wakefield. There was Elizabeth, who would marry a duke and live a life largely apart from the bloodshed that consumed her brothers. There was Margaret, who would make the grandest marriage of all, becoming Duchess of Burgundy and a power in European affairs, and who would spend her later years as the implacable enemy of the dynasty that destroyed her house. There was George, the charming and treacherous one, who would betray his brother, be reconciled, betray him again, and die at last in the Tower on that brother's order. And there was Richard, the youngest, born in the autumn of 1452, the slight and serious boy who would grow up loyal to Edward, and then, when Edward was dead, take the throne from Edward's sons and reign and die as Richard III. 2 kings, a Duchess of Burgundy, and a clutch of others who married into the first rank of the nobility. It was an extraordinary brood, and from it would come both the triumph and the tragedy of Cecily's later life. She had borne them all and would outlive nearly all. Among these children, one daughter deserves a fuller word, for her later life forms a striking counterpoint to her mother's, and that is Margaret, who became Duchess of Burgundy. Married to the powerful Duke of Burgundy, Margaret went to live at what was then perhaps the most magnificent court in Europe, the dazzling Burgundian court, whose splendour outshone even that of kings, and there she became a figure of real consequence in continental affairs. After the fall of the House of York, it was Margaret, safe across the sea and beyond the reach of the Tudor king, who became the leading patroness of every Yorkist plot against Henry VII, financing pretenders and conspiracies with an implacable hatred for the dynasty that had destroyed her family. In her, the fierce loyalty to the House of York that ran through the whole family burned brightest and longest, outlasting even the cause itself. Where Cecily, in England and under the new king's eye, made her peace with the Tudor order, Margaret, free in Burgundy, waged a tireless private war against it to the end of her days. The contrast between mother and daughter is instructive, the one accommodating herself to hard reality, the other refusing to accept the defeat of her house, and it shows the range of responses that the family's catastrophe drew from its women. Margaret was, in a sense, the unreconciled Cecily, the part of the family that would not bow to the new world. That so formidable a daughter sprang from so formidable a mother is no surprise. The blood of the Rose of Raby ran strong in her children, and in none more fiercely than in the Duchess, who carried the Yorkist cause into exile and kept it burning long after the last Yorkist king was dead. The years in France gave Cecily her first taste of life, lived at the very top of the wider sphere, and they were grand years while they lasted. In the early 1440s, Richard of York was appointed to the highest position the Lancastrian crown could bestow upon a subject: the governance of the English-held lands in France, the remnant of the proud conquests of an earlier reign, with his seat at the city of Ruan in Normandy. It was an office of enormous prestige, marking York out as the foremost magnate of the kingdom, the king's own lieutenant in his French dominions, and she crossed the Channel to take her place at his side as the first lady of that court. It was here, in the spring of 1442, that she gave birth to the son who would become Edward IV, and the place of his birth in the grand setting of the ducal court at Ruan, rather than in some modest English manor, would in time take on an unexpected and sinister significance in the slanders that gathered around his name. For now, though, Ruan was simply the height of the family's fortunes, a season of splendour, the Duke governing a kingdom's territories and the Duchess keeping a court fit for royalty. To be the first lady of the English court in France was to occupy a position of real magnificence, and it is worth picturing the world Cecily moved through in those Ruan years. The court she presided over was a quasi-royal establishment, for her husband governed as the king's lieutenant, exercising in France an authority second only to the crown's, and the Duchess at the head of such a court lived amid a ceremony and a splendour that approached the regal. There would have been the vast household with its scores of servants and officers, the feasts and the formal receptions, the entertaining of envoys and notables, the display of wealth and status through clothing and plate and furnishing that proclaimed the consequence of the House of York. Rouen was a great and ancient city, the capital of English Normandy, and the ducal residence there was a setting fit for the grandest occasions. For a young duchess, still in her 20s, to preside over such a court must have been a heady experience, the fullest expression yet of the high destiny her marriage had brought her. It was here, at the summit of these grand early years, that she bore the son who would be king, in surroundings of a magnificence that marked the family's standing at its height. The Rouen years were, in a sense, the first flowering of everything her marriage had promised: wealth, status, a high position in the world, a court of her own to command. That they coincided with the slow beginning of the family's troubles, that the grandeur was already shadowed by the gathering failure in France, only adds to their poignancy. For a while, in Rouen, she lived the grand life her birth and marriage had destined her for, before the long descent into war began. But the French command also gave Cecily her first hard lesson in how quickly fortune could turn. For York's time in France coincided with the long, grinding collapse of the English position there. The war that had once gone so gloriously for England was turning irreversibly against it. Territory was being lost, the French crown was resurgent, and the cost of holding what remained was mounting beyond what the English government could bear. York found himself presiding over retreat and defeat, starved of the money and men he needed from a home government that was growing weak and divided, and increasingly at odds with the court faction that controlled the king and the purse strings. He came to feel with justice that he was being set up to fail, denied the resources to do his job, and then blamed for the failure that resulted. The seeds of his later bitter quarrel with the Lancastrian court were sown in these French years, in the experience of being undermined and slighted by the men around the king, while he laboured to hold an impossible position. She watched her husband's growing resentment take shape, watched the loyal servant of the crown begin to nurse the grievances that would one day curdle into open opposition. The grand days at Rouen carried within them the first signs of the conflict that would eventually destroy so much of what she loved. The collapse in France did more than sour York's mood. It poisoned his standing at home and set the pattern of grievance that would define the rest of his career. As the English possessions in France were lost, someone had to be blamed, and the politics of the Lancastrian court ensured that a good share of the blame fell on York, whether or not he deserved it. He had governed in France during years of retreat and defeat, starved of resources by a home government that then held the failure against him and his rivals at court, who controlled the king and the flow of favour, were happy to see him cast as the author of disasters that were in truth the fault of the whole failing regime. York came away from France, convinced that he had been used and discarded, set up to fail, and then scapegoated for failing. His loyal service rewarded with suspicion and slander. The bitterness of that experience hardened in him and never left. It was the seed of his long quarrel with the court party, the origin of the sense of grievance that would drive him, step by step, from loyal subject to armed opponent to claimant of the throne itself. Cecily watched it take root. She saw her husband return from France, a man with a wound in his pride that would not heal, and she would live to see that wound, festering across the years, draw the whole kingdom into war. The loss of France was not only a national humiliation, it was the beginning of the road that led to Wakefield, and she was there at the start of it, watching the grievance take hold. It is worth remembering, amid the politics, that these French years also touched Cecily in the most intimate way, for it was at Rouen that she bore the son who would become the greatest of her children. To give birth in the ducal palace at Rouen, the first lady of the English court in France, was to bring a child into the world at the very height of the family's fortunes, surrounded by a magnificence that few English noblewomen ever knew. The boy born there, Edward, would carry the place of his birth with him in an odd way. For it was the foreignness and the grandeur of that Rouen birth that would later lend a strange plausibility to the slander that he was no true son of York, as though a child born in such circumstances, far from England, in a great foreign city, might more easily be imagined the fruit of some irregularity. The truth, of course, is that a duchess on campaign with her husband bore her child where the campaign happened to find her, and Rouen was simply where the family was. But the splendour of Edward's birthplace, which should have been a mark of the family's glory, would be twisted by later malice into a shadow on his legitimacy and his mother's honour. For now, though, it was simply a triumph. The birth of a fine and vigorous son in the great city the Duke governed, an heir to carry the House of York forward, born at the summit of his parents' fortunes. The grandeur of that beginning makes the slander all the more cruel, but it could not have been foreseen. She bore her son in glory, and only afterward would that glory be turned against them both. When the French command ended, the crown found a new place to send the increasingly inconvenient Duke of York, and in the event, it was a kind of honourable exile. In the early 1440s, he was appointed the King's Lieutenant in Ireland, a posting that removed him from the centre of English affairs and the court intrigues that swirled there, and once again, Cecily went with him. The Irish years were quieter than the French ones, a posting on the edge of the English world rather than at the heart of a long war, but they show again the pattern of her life in these decades. The Duchess who followed her husband, wherever his service took him, who crossed seas and moved her household and bore her children in whatever castle or town his career required. Ireland would later prove useful to the House of York in a way no one could have foreseen, for York governed there with a fairness that won him genuine Irish goodwill, and that reservoir of loyalty would one day provide a refuge and a base of support for the Yorkist cause in its hours of need. For her, though, the Irish interlude was simply another chapter in the long, mobile partnership of her marriage. Another place to keep a noble household and raise her growing brood, Another stage in the restless progress of a family that seemed always to be in motion, always in the service of a crown that valued that service less and less. The storm was still gathering, but for a few years on the green edge of the world in Ireland, the family had a measure of peace before it broke. The Irish posting also revealed something of York's quality as a governor, and by extension of the kind of rule that she shared in as his partner. In Ireland, York governed with a fairness and a competence that won him a genuine following, treating the Irish lords with a respect that the English crown did not always trouble to show, and building a reservoir of goodwill that would later serve the Yorkist cause in its hour of need. This was characteristic of the man and of the enterprise he and his Duchess ran together, for all his pride and his grievances. York was an able administrator who took the work of governance seriously, and the household and affinity that the two of them maintained were instruments of effective rule as much as displays of grandeur. She, as his partner in the joint enterprise of their joint position, shared in this work and in the reputation it built. The Irish years, quiet as they were, added to the family's standing a base of loyal support that would prove its worth when the storms came, and they showed the House of York at its best competent, fair-minded, and genuinely effective in the exercise of the authority entrusted to it. It is worth remembering this side of York and his Duchess, the able and conscientious governors, alongside the grander drama of their dynastic ambitions. For it was part of what made the House of York a serious contender for power. They were not mere schemers reaching for a crown. They were capable rulers who governed well where they were given the chance. And that competence was among their real assets in the struggle that lay ahead. The kingdom that the family returned to from Ireland was sliding, slowly and then quickly, toward catastrophe. And to understand what happened to Cecily next, we have to understand the sickness at the heart of it. On the throne sat Henry VI, pious, gentle, well-meaning, and by almost every measure hopelessly unfit for the crown he had inherited as a baby. He had no gift for rule, no capacity to master the hard and violent men around him, no instinct for the ruthless arts that kingship in that age demanded. Worse, he was subject to spells of mental collapse, periods in which his mind withdrew entirely from the world and left him unable to speak, to recognize those around him, or to govern in any sense at all. A kingdom cannot run itself, and into the vacuum, left by a feeble and intermittently insane king, poured the ambitions of the mighty nobles, each manoeuvring for control of the king, the council, and the vast patronage of the crown. The court came to be dominated by a faction around the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, and her favourites, who controlled access to the king and the flow of royal favour, and who regarded the powerful, royally descended Duke of York as their chief rival and threat. York, for his part, believed himself excluded from the influence and the offices that his rank and his loyalty entitled him to. Slighted and sidelined by a corrupt and grasping court party that was misgoverning the kingdom and beggaring the crown. In this poisoned situation, the Duke of York's grievances hardened into something that began, by slow degrees, to look like opposition to the regime itself. He cast himself as the champion of good government against a corrupt court, the loyal prince of the blood who sought only to reform a failing administration and take his rightful place at the king's council. His enemies cast him as an overmighty subject whose true aim was the throne itself. The truth, as so often, lay somewhere in the contested middle and shifted over time. For York's ambitions almost certainly grew as the conflict deepened and as the weakness of the Lancastrian regime laid bare how close he himself stood to the succession. For lurking beneath the whole quarrel was the explosive question of the royal blood. Henry VI's grandfather had taken the throne by deposing and murdering his predecessor, an usurpation that had never been entirely legitimate in the eyes of all, and York, through his Mortimer descent, could argue a claim to the crown that was arguably senior to the king's own. So long as that claim remained unspoken, the quarrel was about reform and influence. But everyone understood that it might, under sufficient pressure, become a claim to the throne itself, and that if it did, the disagreement between the Duke and the court would become a war over the crown of England. Through all of this, Cecily stood at her husband's side, and we should not imagine her as a passive spectator to her family's growing peril. She was the Duchess of York, the mistress of a vast household and a wide affinity, a woman of formidable intelligence and royal blood, who shared fully in her husband's status, and, we may be sure, in his counsels. The wives of mighty magnates in that age were not ornamental figures kept apart from the hard business of politics. They ran vast establishments, managed estates and finances, maintained the networks of correspondence and hospitality and patronage on which noble power depended, and stood as their husbands' partners and deputies in the management of the family interest. She would have been deeply versed in the affairs that consumed her husband, fully aware of the dangers gathering around the House of York, and fully invested in the family's cause. For that cause was the future of her own children. As the quarrel between York and the court deepened toward violence, she was not a bystander, but a participant. Her own fortunes and her children's bound up entirely in the success or failure of her husband's increasingly dangerous course. The peace of the Irish years was over. The family was being drawn, step by step, into a conflict that would cost it almost everything. And she was being drawn in with it. The long quarrel between York and the court turned to open bloodshed for the first time in the spring of 1455 at the town of St. Albans, in a short and sharp clash that is generally reckoned the first battle of the wars. York, shut out of power and fearing for his safety, resorted at last to arms, confronting the royal forces in the streets of the town and winning a quick victory in which several of his chief enemies among the court party were killed. It was, by the standards of what would follow, a small affair, more a violent skirmish than a great battle, and it ended with York once more in control of the king's person and restored, for a time, to the influence he craved. But its significance was enormous, for it broke the taboo on open violence between the great factions and showed that the quarrel would, in the end, be settled by the sword. The first blood had been shed, the first of the court lords killed, and the long slide into civil war had begun in earnest. For Cecily, watching from within the Yorkist camp, St. Albans must have brought a mixture of relief and dread relief that her husband had prevailed and survived, dread at the knowledge that the conflict had now passed beyond words and into killing, and that there could be no easy way back from the spilling of noble blood. The wars that would consume her family had drawn their first blood, and though no one could yet see how far it would go, the path to Wakefield and beyond had been opened. Standing across the field from York and his Neville allies, the driving force of the court party was the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the long duel between Margaret and the House of York forms much of the backdrop to Cecily's middle years. Margaret was everything. A queen of that age was not supposed to be forceful, political, and utterly determined. A woman who, faced with a husband incapable of ruling and a son whose inheritance was under threat, took up the cause of the crown with a ferocity that her enemies found monstrous and her allies found magnificent. She saw in York the chief threat to her son's birthright, and she fought him with all the weapons she possessed, becoming in time the effective leader of the Lancastrian cause. Between Margaret and Cecily, there is a striking and instructive contrast. Both were proud, able, royally connected women caught up in the same wars. Both fought in their different ways for the futures of their sons. But where Margaret seized open political and military leadership and was vilified for it across the centuries as a she-wolf and a virago, Cecily worked within the bounds that the age permitted a woman, never openly leading, never taking the field, and largely escaped the savage condemnation that fell on her Lancastrian rival. The two women were, in a sense, mirror images. The Queen who reached openly for power and was damned for it, and the Duchess who exercised her influence in subtler ways and was spared. Their long opposition, played out across the battles and betrayals of the wars, was one of the defining rivalries of the age. Two formidable women on opposite sides of a quarrel that would consume them both. The opening of the wars also marked, for Cecily, the beginning of a long education in fear. For from this point forward, she lived with the knowledge that her husband and her sons might at any time be killed. Each campaign, each march, every gathering of armed men carried the possibility that the men she loved would not return, and a noblewoman in her position spent much of the conflict waiting for news from fields she could not see, for word of victory or defeat, for the return of her menfolk or the report of their deaths. It is a dimension of the wars that the battle-focused histories tend to miss. The anxious waiting of the women, who could not fight and could not flee the danger their men were in, but could only wait and pray and brace themselves for whatever news arrived. Cecily would have known that waiting intimately, the dread that attended every separation, the relief of each safe return, shadowed always by the knowledge that the next campaign might end differently. And in time, of course, the dreaded news did come from Wakefield, where her husband and her son did not return, the fear made real at last. But for years before that, she lived in its shadow, the wife and mother of fighting men in a fighting age, who knew that the men she loved rode out, again and again, into mortal danger, and who could do nothing but wait to learn whether they would come home. It was its own kind of ordeal, quieter than the battlefield, but no less real, and she endured it for the better part of 3 decades. It is worth saying plainly what the wars cost the country as a whole, for Cecily's private tragedy was played out against a backdrop of national suffering, and she was far from alone in her losses. The Wars of the Roses were not, for the most part, a conflict that devastated the general population in the way that some later wars would. Much of the fighting was confined to the magnates and their retinues, and ordinary life went on, in the main, between the bursts of violence. But the toll among the nobility was severe, for it was the foremost families who fought and died, and across the decades of the conflict, an extraordinary number of lords and their heirs were killed in battle or executed after it. Whole lineages thinned or extinguished, the upper ranks of English society bled white by the old quarrel. Cecily's own losses, a husband, sons, a nephew, were part of this larger pattern of aristocratic slaughter, the wars consuming the very families that waged them. There is a grim sense in which the Wars of the Roses were a kind of collective suicide of the English nobility, the foremost houses destroying one another across 3 decades until the survivors, exhausted and diminished, at last accepted the strong new monarchy that would tame them. Cecily lived through the whole of that long self-destruction and survived it, one of the few of her generation to see it through from beginning to end. The price of it was written in the deaths of her own family, but those deaths were part of a wider toll, the bleeding of a whole class in a quarrel that none of them, in the end, truly won. For those who lived through them, the Wars of the Roses were not the neat sequence of battles that later histories made of them, but a long, intermittent nightmare of uncertainty, in which the ground could shift beneath one's feet at any moment. Years of uneasy peace would be broken by sudden eruptions of violence. A family ascendant one season might be ruined the next. Men changed sides as fortune shifted, and no victory ever seemed quite final. The wars were fought, for the most part, not by wider national armies but by the retinues and affinities of the magnates, the armed followings that the mighty lords could summon, which meant that the conflict ran along the lines of the noble families and their connections, pitting cousin against cousin and tearing apart the very web of marriages and alliances that bound the aristocracy together. For a woman in Cecily's position, this meant a life lived under a perpetual low hum of danger and uncertainty, never sure when the next eruption would come or which way it would go, her family's fortunes and her loved ones' lives forever hostage to the turning of fortune's wheel. The relative rarity of the actual battles can mislead us. The wars were not constant open fighting, but a constant condition of instability and threat, punctuated by sudden catastrophes. Cecily lived in that condition for the better part of 30 years, and it is no wonder that she developed the wary self-command, the readiness for sudden reversal, the steel beneath the courtesy that marked her whole character. She had learned, in the hardest school, that nothing was secure and that the wheel never stopped turning. The first time the gathering storm broke directly over Cecily's own head came in the autumn of 1459 at a place called Ludford Bridge, and the scene that followed has become one of the defining images of her courage. By then, the quarrel between York and the court had flared into open-armed confrontation more than once, and on this occasion the Yorkist lords had gathered their forces near the town of Ludlow on the Welsh marches to face a royal army marching against them. But the Yorkist position collapsed before a battle could be fought. A crucial body of their troops deserted to the king in the night, and the Yorkist cause, suddenly hopelessly outnumbered, fell apart in the darkness and confusion. The leaders fled, the Duke of York escaping toward Ireland, his eldest sons and their allies making for the coast and the safety of Calais. They left in such haste and in such danger that they could not take their families with them. And so, when the victorious royal army descended upon the town of Ludlow the next day, they found, waiting for them in the open, the Duchess of York herself, standing with her two youngest sons, George and little Richard, mere children at the market cross, having chosen to meet the conquerors rather than flee. The image of that moment has come down through the centuries as a portrait of remarkable composure under terror. Ludlow was given over to plunder by the king's victorious soldiers, the town sacked and pillaged as the spoils of war. And into that chaos and violence stood the Duchess, a noblewoman of royal blood, with two small boys beside her, entirely at the mercy of an army that had every reason to regard her as the wife of a traitor. She did not hide. She did not flee. She stood by the accounts that have survived, with a dignity and a steadiness that held even in that desperate hour. It was an act of extraordinary nerve and also, very likely, of shrewd calculation, for a duchess of her rank, the great-granddaughter of a king, was a person of real value, too important to be casually harmed, and her composed surrender placed her under the protection of her own consequence. To have fled would have been to become a fugitive. To stand was to remain the Duchess of York, whose person commanded a respect that even victorious enemies dared not wholly violate. She and her young sons were taken into custody, placed in the care of her own sister, and held while the men of the family regrouped abroad. Cecily had faced the wreck of her husband's cause and the violence of his enemies, and she had come through it with her dignity and her children intact. It would not be the last time she had to summon that hard composure, but it was the first true proof of the steel that lay beneath the rose of Raby. What followed for Cecily after that day at the market cross was a period of captivity and humiliation that tested her endurance in a quieter but no less real way than the drama of the surrender itself. With her husband fled abroad and his cause in ruins, she and her young children were taken into custody, their lands and goods forfeit, their future entirely uncertain. She was placed in the keeping of her own sister, who was married to a leading supporter of the court party, an arrangement that spared her the worst indignities, but left her a prisoner nonetheless, a great duchess reduced to a dependent in another household. Stripped of her position and her freedom, and waiting on the turn of events she could not control. It was a strange and bitter interlude. The proud mistress of a ruling house, become a kept woman in her sister's home. Her husband, a hunted fugitive. Her family's fortunes at their lowest ebb. For a woman of Cecily's pride, the loss of status and autonomy must have galled almost as much as the danger. Yet she endured it as she endured everything, with a composure that gave her enemies nothing to seize upon. Waiting out the bad months with the patience of one who had learned that fortune's wheel turned both ways. The wheel did turn. Within the year, her husband and sons would return in force, and the proud duchess would be restored. But she had tasted captivity and dependence, and the taste of it would have sharpened still further the steel that her later trials would so often require. The decision to stand at the market cross rather than flee repays a closer look, for it reveals something essential about how a noble lady navigated the violence of her age. Cecily could not have fought, and flight with two small children, in the chaos of a sacked town, would have been desperate and perhaps deadly. What she had instead was her rank, and she used it as a kind of armour. To stand openly as the Duchess of York, a great-granddaughter of a king, was to invoke a status that even victorious and plundering soldiers hesitated to violate. For there were limits in that world to what could be done to a person of her consequence without dishonour and without risk of reprisal. A woman of her standing was too valuable, too well connected, too dangerous to harm casually. Her very prominence was a protection, provided she stood her ground and claimed it. To have fled would have been to throw away that armour and become merely a fugitive prey to whoever caught her. To stand was to remain the Duchess, clothed in the consequence of her birth and marriage. It was a shrewd reading of her situation, as well as a brave one, and it worked. She and her children were taken into honourable custody rather than harmed. The episode shows us that Cecily's pride was not mere vanity, but a practical instrument of survival, that the rank she insisted upon so fiercely was, in moments like this, the very thing that kept her and her children alive. She understood the uses of her own consequence, and she deployed it, when she had to, with cool and deliberate skill. The reprieve was real but brief, for within little more than a year, the conflict reached its first shattering climax, and this time it brought Cecily not danger, but the deepest catastrophe of her life. The Yorkist lords returned from exile in force, and after a season of fighting and manoeuvring, the Duke of York at last took the step that everyone had long feared and half expected. He laid formal claim to the throne of England itself, advancing his Mortimer descent against the title of the reigning king. A compromise was patched together, by which Henry VI would keep the crown for his lifetime, but York and his heirs would succeed him, disinheriting the king's own son. It was a settlement that satisfied no one, and that the Queen, fighting for her son's inheritance, would never accept. As the year 1460 drew to its close, York marched north to confront the Lancastrian forces gathering against him, and there, at the very end of December, outside his castle of Sandal near Wakefield, he met them in battle, and was killed. With him died his second son Edmund, Cecily's boy, a youth of 17, cut down in the rout, or murdered in its aftermath. In a single winter day, she lost her husband of more than 30 years, and one of her sons, and the cause to which the family had given everything seemed to lie in ruins on a frozen Yorkshire field. What Cecily felt in the days after Wakefield we can only imagine, for she left no lament that has survived. But the scale of the blow is not hard to measure. She was a widow at 45, her husband of 3 decades killed on a battlefield, her son Edmund slain beside him, the cause that had defined her adult life, apparently broken beyond repair, and the cruelty of the victors made the grief into a public horror. For the heads of her husband and her son were struck off and set upon the gates of the city of York, and upon the Duke's head, in savage mockery of his royal pretensions, was placed a paper crown. A mother and a widow was thus made to know that the bodies of her slain had been desecrated and displayed, their severed heads jeered at above a city's gate. It is among the bleakest moments in the whole bleak story of these wars, and she had to absorb it while the Lancastrian cause was triumphant and her remaining family in mortal danger. Yet even now she did not break. With the enemy ascendant and her younger children at risk, she acted with the same cool resolve she had shown at Ludlow, moving to protect what remained of her family and to safeguard the future of the cause that had cost her so much. She sent her two youngest sons, George and Richard, abroad to the safety of the Low Countries, out of the reach of the vengeful Lancastrian regime, preserving the boys who would both, in time, become significant in the realm. Her husband was dead, and his head crowned with paper, but his blood survived in his sons, and she set herself to the work of keeping that blood alive. The desecration of her husband's body carried a meaning that everyone of the age would have understood, and it was meant to wound far beyond the grave. To strike off the head of a defeated enemy and display it above a city gate was a common enough horror in those wars, a public proclamation of victory and a warning to others. But to set a paper crown upon the head of the Duke of York was a refinement of cruelty aimed precisely at his deepest pretension, a jeering answer to his claim upon the throne, a way of saying, "Here is your crown, here is the kingship you reached for," a thing of paper set on a dead man's severed head above a gate. It was mockery raised to the level of theatre, the victors turning York's royal ambition into a grotesque joke for all to see. And it was Cecily, his widow, who had to live with the knowledge of it, to carry in her mind the image of the husband she had loved for 30 years, reduced to a jeered-at trophy crowned in paper. There is a special cruelty in violence done to the dead, for it can no longer touch its object and can only wound the living who loved them. The paper crown could not hurt Richard of York, who was beyond all hurt. It was aimed at the living, at his cause, at his followers, and above all, perhaps, at the proud wife and sons who survived him. That Cecily bore even this, and did not break, is among the strongest proofs of the iron in her. She absorbed the unabsorbable and went on, because her surviving children needed her to, and because going on was the one form of defiance left to her. We might pause too on what the loss of Edmund meant amid the larger catastrophe of Wakefield. For in the grand narrative of the Duke's fall, it is easy to overlook the death of the boy. Edmund was Cecily's second surviving son, a youth of 17, on the very threshold of manhood, who had ridden out with his father and did not come home. The accounts suggest he was killed in the rout or its aftermath, cut down as the Yorkist forces broke, perhaps even dispatched in cold blood after the fighting. A boy barely grown, slaughtered in the wreck of his father's cause. The death of Edmund, for her, was the loss of a child, raw and simple beneath all the dynastic significance, the first of the sons she would bury, and in some ways the most purely pitiable, for he died so young and with so little of his life lived. The histories tend to fold his death into his father's, a footnote to the great man's fall. But to his mother, he was not a footnote. He was her boy, 17 years old, dead in the snow far from home. And his loss would have been a grief entire in itself, distinct from and additional to the loss of her husband. She lost a partner of 30 years and a child barely grown on the same dreadful day, and the double blow fell on her at once. That she gathered herself even from this, and acted to save her remaining sons, is among the strongest evidence of the formidable strength that lay within her. But the strength should not blind us to the grief. A mother lost her boy at Wakefield, and no amount of dynastic significance could make that anything other than a mother's grief. And then, with the bewildering speed that marked the whole of these wars, the wheel turned again, and turned in her favour beyond anything she could have dared to hope. Her eldest son, Edward, the boy born at Ruan, now a strapping youth of 18 and a soldier of startling ability, did not accept his father's defeat as final. Within weeks of Wakefield, he had gathered the Yorkist forces, won a hard victory in the field, marched on London, and there, in the early spring of 1461, was proclaimed king as Edward IV. He then marched north and met the main Lancastrian army at Towton, in a battle fought in a driving snowstorm that was, by reckoning of the dead, the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. Edward won it, crushingly, and with that victory the House of York held the throne. In the space of a few months, Cecily had passed from the lowest point of her life to a height almost beyond comprehension. The widow whose husband's head wore a paper crown above the gates of York was now the mother of the crowned and anointed King of England. Her dead husband had reached for the throne and failed and died. Her living son had reached for it and seized it. The cause was not broken after all. It had triumphed, and she, Neville, so lately a grieving widow facing ruin, was now the mother of the king and the first lady of the realm in all but name. The victory that secured her son's throne was bought at a price in blood that staggers the imagination even now. 3 weeks after Edward was proclaimed king in London, he met the main Lancastrian army in the north, near the village of Towton, on a freezing day in late March, amid a driving snowstorm. And there was fought what is generally reckoned the largest and bloodiest battle ever to take place on English soil. Tens of thousands fought, and many thousands died. The snow turning red as the Lancastrian army broke at last and was cut down in the rout, the slaughter going on for hours across the frozen fields and the choked rivers. It was a catastrophe for the House of Lancaster, a victory so complete and so murderous that it left the Yorkist regime for the moment unchallengeable. For her, the news of Towton would have brought a fierce vindication mingled with the knowledge of its terrible cost. Her son had not merely claimed the throne, he had won it in the bloodiest field in the nation's history, breaking his enemies so thoroughly that the crown seemed, for a time, securely his. The cause for which her husband had died, and her son Edmund had been killed, had triumphed utterly, drowned in the blood of its enemies. It was the height of the Yorkist tide, the moment when everything Cecily had suffered for seemed at last to have been worth the cost. That the triumph would prove far less final than it appeared. That the wars would flare again and again and consume still more of her family, no one could yet see. For now, after Towton, the House of York stood victorious on a mountain of the dead, and she was the mother of the king who stood atop it. With Edward secure on the throne, Cecily's own position was transformed in ways that touched the whole of her daily existence. She was now the mother of the reigning king, a position without any exact precedent or definition, and she set about giving it the grandest possible shape. She took precedence over almost every other woman in the realm, save the Queen herself. She commanded vast revenues from the land settled upon her. She presided over a household of royal magnificence and dispensed a patronage that made her a power worth courting. Suitors sought her favour as a road to the king's. Petitioners brought her their causes. The great and the ambitious paid court to the king's mother as a matter of course. The woman who had so recently been a fugitive and a near prisoner now stood among the very greatest in the land, her wants all supplied, her dignity acknowledged by all, her influence over her royal son a matter of national consequence. It was a dizzying elevation, and Cecily embraced it fully, taking to the role of king's mother with all the assurance of one who felt the position no more than her due. She had paid for it, after all, in the blood of her husband and her son. If she now enjoyed the fruits of the victory those deaths had purchased, who could begrudge her? And she did not stint herself. The grandeur of these years was real, and she had earned every particle of it the hardest way there is. The practical substance of a king's mother's power is worth setting out, for it was considerable and quite concrete, however little formal authority she held. Cecily's position rested first of all on land, on the vast estates settled upon her, which yielded an income that made her one of the wealthiest people in the realm, and gave her the means to maintain a household and an affinity on a near-royal scale. Wealth on that level was power in itself, for it commanded service, bought loyalty, and underwrote the patronage by which the great bound lesser men to themselves. Beyond her wealth, she had access, the ear of the king, the ability to bring a suit or a name before him, to speak for a petitioner or against an enemy, to influence the flow of royal favour in ways that those seeking the king's good will understood very well. Suitors came to her precisely because she could open doors that were closed to others. Her good word was worth having, and her ill will worth avoiding. She maintained, too, the networks of correspondence and connection through which a noble family kept itself informed and effective, a web of contacts spanning the kingdom and reaching abroad. None of this was formal office. She held no post, sat on no council by right, wielded no authority that the law recognized. But the informal power was real and considerable, rooted in wealth, access, and connection. And Cecily wielded it with the assurance of a woman who had been near the centre of great affairs her whole life. To call her merely the king's mother is to understate what she was. She was a magnate in her own right, rich, connected, and influential, and the deference she commanded was the acknowledgement of a real and weighty power. The reversal of her fortunes in that single year, from the depths of Wakefield to the heights of her son's coronation, is so extreme that it strains belief, and it is worth dwelling on the sheer violence of the swing. In the last days of December, she was a widow whose husband's head wore a paper crown above a city gate, her son dead beside him, her cause apparently destroyed, herself a grieving woman gathering her remaining children against an ascendant enemy. Within 3 months, her eldest son was the crowned and anointed King of England. The enemy was shattered on the bloody field of Towton, and she herself was the mother of the king and the first lady of the realm, from the lowest pit of catastrophe to the highest peak of triumph in the space of a single winter and spring. Few lives have ever swung so far, so fast. It must have been almost vertiginous to live through the ground, heaving from ruin to glory between one season and the next, and it would have taught Cecily, if her earlier trials had not already, the terrible mutability of fortune, the way the wheel could lift one to the heights as suddenly as it cast one down. She had learned both motions of the wheel in a single year. The lesson would have stayed with her, beneath all her later grandeur. The knowledge bought at the price of a husband and a son, that nothing was secure, that triumph and disaster were neighbours, and that the same wheel which had lifted her so high could, without warning, bring her low again. As indeed, in time, it would. The whole of Cecily's career illuminates a larger truth about the place of women in the politics of her age, and it is worth drawing out. Women were barred, in principle, from the formal exercise of power. They could not sit on the king's council in their own right, could not lead armies under their own banners, could not hold the high offices of state, could not rule except as regents for absent or infant kings, and even then only with difficulty and amid suspicion, The public world of government and war was a male preserve, and a woman who reached too openly for its levers was regarded as a kind of monster, an unnatural creature violating the proper order of the sexes. And yet women of Cecily's rank were very far from powerless, for alongside the formal world of male authority ran an informal world of influence in which they could be central players. Through their management of estates and households, their control of marriages and inheritances, their networks of patronage and correspondence, their influence over husbands and sons, and their command of wealth and connection, great ladies shaped events in ways that the formal record often misses. Cecily exercised exactly this kind of informal power, and exercised it masterfully, never openly, never in a way that exposed her to the charge of unwomanly ambition, but constantly and effectively through the channels that her age left open to a woman of her position. To understand her, and women like her, we have to look past the formal structures of power from which they were excluded, to the informal ones in which they were often decisive. She was not a ruler, but she was a power. And the distinction is one the whole age understood. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that Cecily came so close to being queen in her own person and never was. Had the compromise settlement held, or had her husband lived a few months longer, it might have been Richard of York who took the throne, and she who was crowned beside him as Queen Consort of England. Instead, the crown passed over her, from her dead husband to her living son, and she became not a queen, but the mother of a king, a position of immense honour and influence, but not the throne itself. She seems to have felt the near miss keenly, for in the years of her son's reign she would adopt styles and honours that hovered at the very edge of royalty, claiming grand titles, and on at least one occasion, being accorded a style that named her almost as a queen in her own right. Who could blame her? She had been the wife of a man who claimed the throne, the mother of a man who held it, a great-granddaughter of a king in her own blood. She had lost her husband and a son to the cause that had finally won the crown, and yet the crown itself had passed her by, settling on her son's head rather than her own. If she bore herself ever after with the pride that earned her the name Proud Cis, she had perhaps more reason than most. She had come within a hair's breadth of being Queen of England, and had to settle for being merely the mother of the king. The years of her son's reign were the years in which Cecily came fully into the character that history remembers, and the name that has clung to her ever since tells the story. Proud Cis, she was now the mother of the king, and she wore that position with a magnificence that bordered on the regal. She kept a household of near-royal grandeur, ringed herself with the ceremony due to a woman of her blood and her place, and adopted styles and titles that pressed her dignity to the very limit of what was permissible for a subject. In documents she took grand titles to herself, the king's mother, a queen by right of birth, in all but the crown itself, and she expected the deference that such a self-conception demanded. To some this was insufferable arrogance, the pretension of a woman reaching above even her exalted station. To others it was no more than the just due of a great-granddaughter of a king who had given 2 sons to the throne and lost a husband to its winning. Either way, the pride was unmistakable, and it was famous. And it was woven through everything she did in these years. She had been the Rose of Raby in her youth, beautiful and admired. She was Proud Cis in her maturity, formidable and grand. A woman who knew exactly how high she stood and meant for everyone around her to know it too. But the pride was not mere vanity, for it sat atop a foundation of genuine power and real competence, and Cecily wielded both with skill. As the king's mother, she commanded vast estates, a great affinity of servants and retainers and dependents, and an influence at court that flowed from her unique position at the head of the royal family. She managed her enormous landholdings with care and attention, for a noble estate was a complex enterprise requiring constant oversight, and the running of it was no small task. She maintained the networks of patronage and correspondence and hospitality through which noble power was exercised, dispensing favour, hearing petitions, and standing as a figure to whom suitors might turn for access to the king. Her influence over her son the king was a matter of real political consequence, for the mother of a monarch occupied a position that no one else could fill. Bound to him by the deepest tie and able to speak to him as no counsellor could. She was not a ruler, for England did not permit women to rule, but she was a force in the land. And those who sought the king's favour understood that his mother was a person worth cultivating. The pride that earned her the name Proud Cis was the outward sign of an inward reality. She was, in these years, one of the most powerful women in England, and she knew how to use what authority her position gave her. Something should be said, too, of the physical world Cecily moved through in these years, for a lady of her rank lived among grand houses, and hers were the grandest of all. Her chief London residence was Baynard's Castle, a riverside palace on the Thames that had long been associated with the House of York, a place of stone halls and river views from which the family conducted its affairs in the capital. It was no mere dwelling, but a seat of power, a stage on which the dignity of the king's mother was displayed, and it would feature in the family's history at more than one critical moment. Beyond London, she had her great country seats, the castles and manors of the vast York and Neville inheritance, including the castle of Berkhamsted, to which she would eventually retire, and the family church and stronghold of Fotheringhay, where her husband lay buried and where she would one day join him. She moved among these establishments with a noble household in train, as a magnate of her rank was expected to do, carrying her authority and her ceremony from one seat to another. The grandeur of these houses was not idle display. It was the visible expression of power, the setting in which a leading family's consequence was made manifest to the world. She understood this perfectly, and the magnificence of her establishments was part of the same proud self-presentation that earned her her famous name. To stand in the great hall of Baynard's Castle, the mother of the king receiving suitors and dispensing favour, was to occupy a position very near the summit of the kingdom, and she occupied it with all the assurance of one who felt she had earned her place at the top of the world. The bond between Cecily and her son the king was the central relationship of these years, and it was a complicated one, compounded of deep love, fierce pride, and the inevitable friction between two strong wills. Edward owed his mother a great deal. His royal blood came in significant part through her, and her steadiness in the dark days after Wakefield had helped preserve the cause that put him on the throne. He honoured her, settled great estates upon her, and accorded her the dignities her position demanded. Yet he was also very much his own man, a king who would take his own counsel and follow his own desires, as the affair of his secret marriage showed all too plainly. She, for her part, loved her son and gloried in his kingship, but she was not a woman to surrender her opinions or her pride, and there were matters on which mother and king did not see eye to eye. The relationship between a reigning king and a strong-willed mother was always a delicate one, for she was the one person in the realm who could claim a natural authority over him, and yet he was the king to whom all, even mothers, owed obedience. She and Edward seem to have navigated this difficult ground with a mixture of mutual respect and occasional friction, two proud and capable people bound by the deepest of ties and divided now and then by the clash of their strong characters. It was, in the end, a loving but not always an easy relationship, the bond between the king and the mother who had helped to make him, each too formidable to be wholly comfortable with the other's will. There was, too, a piety running alongside the pride, and the two were not in conflict, but oddly of a piece, for Cecily's religion was itself grand, disciplined, and demanding. Even in these years of worldly magnificence, she kept a devotional life of real seriousness, ordering her days in part around the observances of the Church, maintaining the religious foundations and charities expected of a noble lady, and cultivating the intense personal faith that would come to dominate her later years. There was nothing soft or sentimental in her religion. It was rigorous, ordered, and proud in its own way. The devotion of a woman who did nothing by halves. In these years of worldly magnificence, it ran quietly beneath the surface of her grand public life, one strand among many in a crowded existence. But it was there, deepening, waiting. And in the years to come, when the world had taken from her nearly everyone she loved, this serious and demanding faith would rise to the very center of her life and become the thing she lived for. The grandeur of her position and the discipline of her devotion grew side by side in the woman who was both Proud Cis and a servant of God. And in time the second would outlast the first. If anything could puncture Cecily's grand contentment in her son's reign, it was the matter of his marriage. And in the spring of 1464, Edward dealt his mother a shock that, by every account, enraged her. For the young king had married in secret, telling no one, and the bride he had chosen was a woman Cecily could scarcely have approved of less. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, a widow whose birth fell far below a king's, her father no more than a knight, her dead first husband, a Lancastrian who had fought against York, and herself a few years older than Edward, and already the mother of 2 boys. For a king to marry at all without the counsel of his mother and his powerful men was startling. For him to marry secretly was worse. And for him to marry this particular woman, low-born by royal standards, of the wrong political background, bringing neither a foreign alliance, nor a dowry, nor any advantage of state was, to a woman of Cecily's pride and dynastic calculation, very nearly intolerable. She had given everything to raise the House of York to the throne, and now her son had squandered the most valuable card in the royal hand, his own marriage, on a love match with a widow she considered beneath him. The reports of her fury have come down through the centuries, and whatever their precise truth, they ring true to everything we know of her character. Proud Cis, who set such store by blood and rank and the dignity of her house, had been presented with a daughter-in-law she thought unworthy, and presented with her as an accomplished fact she was powerless to undo. The marriage created a situation that must have galled Cecily for years. The presence at the summit of the court of a second woman, younger and now grander than herself, whose position derived from the very son whose elevation was Cecily's proudest achievement. Elizabeth Woodville was now the queen, the anointed consort, the first lady of the realm in title and ceremony, and her household and her honours necessarily outshone those of the king's mother. Cecily, who had carried herself almost as a queen, now had a real queen above her, and one she had neither chosen nor approved. Worse, the new queen brought with her a large family of Woodville relatives, and Edward, in the manner of the age, advanced his wife's kin with marriages and titles and offices, building them into a power at court that the old nobility, and very likely she herself, resented, as the grasping intrusion of upstarts. The mother, who had been the unrivalled matriarch of the royal family, now had to share that family with a queen and a swarm of her relations, none of whom owed their rise to her, and several of whom stood to rival the influence she had enjoyed. It was a diminishment, however gilded, and a woman of her pride would have felt it keenly. The secret marriage was, in this sense, the first crack in the perfect edifice of her son's reign. The first sign that Edward would go his own way, regardless of his mother's wishes, and the first intimation that the House of York, having won its throne, might tear itself apart over who stood where within it. The arrival of the Woodvilles at the summit of the court fed a resentment that went far beyond Cecily's personal feelings, and it is worth understanding the wider grievance, for it would have terrible consequences. The old nobility of England, the old families with their long pedigrees and their ancient lands, looked on with mounting anger as the relatives of the new queen were advanced, married into the greatest houses, granted titles and offices and wardships, woven rapidly into the upper ranks of a society that regarded them as upstarts who had not earned their place. Marriages that the old families had hoped to secure for their own heirs went instead to Woodville brothers and sisters. Influence that the established lords felt was theirs by right flowed instead to the Queen's grasping kin. To a woman of Cecily's pride of blood, all of this would have been deeply distasteful, an offence against the proper order of rank that she held so dear. But it was more than a matter of wounded pride. The resentment of the Woodville ascendancy helped to drive the most powerful of the old nobility, Cecily's own nephew Warwick, into the rebellion that would nearly destroy Edward, and it sowed divisions within the House of York that would bear bitter fruit in the years to come. The secret marriage was not merely a private affront to a proud mother. It was a wound to the whole settled order of the aristocracy, and the bitterness it bred would feed the conflicts that lay ahead. Cecily's distaste was the personal edge of a grievance that ran through the whole nobility, and that grievance would help to tear her family apart. Yet here, as so often, we must be careful to separate the legend from what can actually be known. For the tale of Cecily's reaction to the marriage has grown in the telling. That she was displeased seems beyond doubt. The match offended against everything she valued, and the sources that report her anger are consistent with her known character. But the more lurid versions of the story, in which her fury drove her to extraordinary and even monstrous lengths, belong to a later and darker chapter of the family's history, and we will come to them in their place. For now it is enough to say that the secret marriage strained the bond between Cecily and her eldest son, introduced a rival into the heart of the royal family, and planted a seed of division within the House of York that would, in time, bear bitter fruit. She remained a figure of honour and influence. She was not cast out or estranged beyond repair, and mother and son continued to deal with one another as the closeness of their tie demanded. But something had shifted. Edward had shown that he would be his own master, even against his mother's strong wishes, and she had learned that the son she had raised to the throne was now, in the fullest sense, beyond her control. For a woman accustomed to command, it was a hard lesson, and the marriage that taught it would prove to be only the first of the trials her own children would visit upon her. The strains within the House of York that the secret marriage first revealed soon widened into open warfare, and once again she found her own kin on opposing sides. Her nephew, the mighty Earl of Warwick, who had done so much to make Edward king, grew estranged from the king he had raised, resentful of the Woodvilles who had displaced him in royal favour, and of a master who would no longer be guided. By the end of the 1460s, Warwick had turned against Edward in open rebellion, and in a stunning reversal, he made common cause with the very Lancastrians he had fought all his life, forced Edward into brief exile abroad, and set the deposed king of that house back upon the throne for a few strange months. For her, the conflict was an agony of divided loyalty in the sharpest form, for it set her nephew against her son, Neville against York, the two halves of her own blood at war with one another. She had been born a Neville and married a York, and now the families she belonged to by birth and by marriage were tearing at each other, with her son's crown and perhaps his life at stake. Edward, characteristically, did not stay beaten. He returned in force in the spring of 1471, and in two decisive battles destroyed his enemies utterly. At the first, Warwick himself was killed, Cecily's nephew, the kingmaker, cut down in the rout, the Neville power broken at last. The wars had now taken from Cecily not only her husband and a son, but a nephew too, the great Earl, who was her brother's child, killed by the army of her own son. The House of York had survived, but it had done so by destroying the House of Neville, and she, who belonged to both, had watched her blood spill its own blood. The triumph of York was for her shadowed by the destruction of the family she had been born into. Now we come to one of the strangest and most persistent stories ever attached to Cecily's name. A slander that would surface again and again across the centuries, and that touched her honour more intimately than any other charge. It concerns the birth of her eldest son Edward at Ruan in the spring of 1442, and it holds that the boy who became Edward IV was not, in truth, the son of the Duke of York at all, but the child of an affair between Cecily and a common soldier, an archer of the Ruan garrison, named in some versions as a man called Blayborn. By this telling, the future King of England was a bastard, conceived in adultery, with no true claim to the throne his father's house had won, and his mother, a woman who had betrayed her marriage with a man far beneath her. It is a startling charge to level at a woman of Cecily's pride and piety, and it has clung to her memory with remarkable tenacity. Repeated by her enemies in her own lifetime, and revived by historians and storytellers ever since. The question of whether there is anything to it has fascinated people for 500 years, and it deserves to be weighed honestly rather than either dismissed out of hand or accepted as proven, for the truth is genuinely uncertain and likely to remain so. What can be said is this: the charge surfaced at moments when it was politically convenient for someone to blacken Edward's legitimacy, which is exactly when we should be most suspicious of it. It was muttered during a quarrel between Edward and his cousin Warwick, when discrediting the king served a rebel's purpose. It was raised again, most damagingly, when Edward's own brother Richard sought to set aside Edward's children and take the throne himself. For if Edward had been a bastard, his line had no right to rule, and Richard's did. A slander that appears precisely when it is useful to the person spreading it is a slander to be treated with great caution. Against it stands the plain fact that the Duke of York himself never repudiated Edward, raised him as his heir, and treated him in every way as his true-born son, which he would hardly have done had he genuinely believed the boy another man's bastard. The supposed timing of Edward's conception, which some have tried to use as evidence that York was away campaigning when the child must have been begotten, turns out on examination to be far from conclusive. The date's loose enough to permit York's paternity easily, and the charge asks us to believe something deeply improbable, that the proud, pious, fiercely dynastic Cecily Neville, of all women, conceived a child in adultery with a common archer and then passed him off as the heir to one of the greatest houses in England. On balance, then, the story is almost certainly false, a politically motivated slander that exploited the impossibility of ever proving a child's paternity in order to wound a king through his mother's honour. But it is worth pausing on the peculiar cruelty of it, and on what it reveals about the world Cecily lived in. A man's legitimacy, in that age, rested entirely on his mother's fidelity, which could never be proven beyond doubt, and this made the accusation of bastardy an uniquely powerful weapon, and one that fell, always, on a woman's reputation. To attack Edward's right to rule was to attack his mother's chastity. There was no other way to do it, and so Cecily, who had given everything to her family's cause, found her own honour made the battleground on which her son's enemies fought, her supposed adultery the lever by which they tried to topple him. There is a special bitterness in the fact that the slander would be revived, most woundingly of all, by one of her own sons against another, when Richard reached for the throne over the bodies of Edward's children. To take a throne by branding your dead brother a bastard was also, unavoidably, to brand your own mother an adulteress, a thing we will have cause to remember when we come to that dark hour. For now it is enough to say that the Ruan story, whatever its origins, was almost surely a lie, but a lie that she would have to live with, and that her own family would one day turn into a weapon against itself. Of all the trials Cecily's children visited upon her, none was more drawn out or more agonizing than the lasting treachery of her son George, the Duke of Clarence. George was the third of her surviving sons, and by all accounts the most superficially charming and the most fundamentally unreliable of the brood, handsome, plausible, ambitious, and consumed by a restless resentment that he was a younger son with no throne of his own, where his brother Edward had a crown and his brother Richard would prove steadfastly loyal. George could never be content with the vast wealth and honour that came to him as the king's brother, and he turned again and again to intrigue and rebellion in pursuit of more. In the upheavals of Edward's reign, when their cousin Warwick turned against the king, George threw in his lot with the rebels, betraying his own brother, and even, for a time, allying himself with the Lancastrian enemies the family had fought so hard to destroy. He married Warwick's daughter against the king's wishes, joined in armed revolt, and schemed for a greater share of power and perhaps for the throne itself. When the rebellion failed, he abandoned Warwick and crept back to Edward's side, was forgiven, and then, incapable of staying still, began to intrigue anew. He was a perpetual source of danger and grief, a son who could be neither trusted nor, for many years, brought to heel. There is a question worth asking about George, and it touches Cecily as a mother. What was it that drove him, again and again, to betray the brother who had everything he lacked? Part of the answer surely lies in the simple bitterness of the younger son, born close enough to the throne to taste it, but never to hold it. Endowed with vast wealth and rank, yet always second to a brother who had the one thing he could never have. George was clever, charming, and ambitious, and he chafed unbearably under the knowledge that an accident of birth order had given Edward the crown and left him a mere duke, however grand. That resentment, feeding on itself across the years, drove him into one intrigue after another, each more reckless than the last, in a restless pursuit of a greatness that was always just beyond his reach. For Cecily, watching this, there must have been a particular pain in seeing one of her sons so consumed by envy of another, so unable to be content with the very large portion that was his. She had borne them both. She loved them both. And she had to watch one of them poison his own life with resentment of the other. There is no harder thing for a parent than to see a child destroy himself, and that, in the end, is what George did. Not struck down by enemies, but ruined by his own ungovernable discontent, his own inability to accept the place that fortune had given him. She could not save him from himself. No one could. The flaw was in George, and it carried him, step by step, to the tower and the death his own brother decreed. The contrast between George and his youngest brother Richard, in their dealings with Edward and with their mother, is striking and instructive. Where George was faithless, Richard, for the whole of Edward's reign, was steadfastly loyal, serving his royal brother ably in the north and standing by him through every crisis. The very model of the trustworthy younger brother that George so signally failed to be. For most of his life, Richard was the good son and the loyal brother, and Cecily would have had ample reason to be proud of him. The one of her younger sons who gave her no grief and brought the family no danger. The bitter irony, of course, is that it was this loyal son, not the faithless one, who would in the end deal the House of York, and his own mother, the cruelest blow of all. Seizing the throne from his brother's children and reviving the slander against his mother's honour. The brother who had been the soul of loyalty became, when the moment came, the agent of the family's final tragedy, while the faithless brother was already dead. There is a lesson in that, about the unpredictability of character under the pressure of supreme temptation, about how the steady and trustworthy man may, when a crown comes within his reach, do things that the known traitor never had the chance to do. Cecily, who knew both her sons, could not have foreseen it. She had grieved over George the faithless and taken comfort, surely, in Richard the loyal. That it was Richard who would break her heart at the last, and not George, is among the cruelest of the many cruel surprises her family sprang upon her. The loyal son proved, in the end, the more dangerous, because no one thought to fear him. For Cecily, George's treachery posed an anguish particular to a mother. The spectacle of her own children turning against one another, and the impossible position of loving sons who were becoming enemies. She seems to have tried more than once to mediate between her warring boys, to use her position as their mother to reconcile Edward and George and hold the family together. There is record of her intervening to make peace between them, summoning her quarrelling sons and pressing them toward reconciliation, exercising the one form of authority a mother retained over grown men who were a king and a duke. It was a thankless and ultimately a hopeless task. George's discontent ran too deep. His ambition was too restless, and Edward's patience, though long, was not inexhaustible. Cecily was caught in the cruelest of binds. For whatever happened, she stood to lose. Every quarrel between her sons was a wound to her. Every punishment Edward might visit on George a grief. Every fresh treachery of George's a danger to the whole house she had built. She loved them both, and they were destroying each other, and there was a limit to what even a formidable mother could do to stop it. The matriarch who had held her family together through war and exile and the deaths of her husband and one son now watched, helpless, as two of her surviving sons drifted toward a reckoning that she could see coming and could not prevent. The reckoning, when it came, was terrible beyond even her fears. By the later 1470s, George's intrigues had at last exhausted Edward's patience entirely. He had behaved with mounting recklessness, taking the law into his own hands, muttering against the king's legitimacy, dabbling once more in something that looked like treason, and Edward, perhaps weary of forgiving a brother who would not be reformed, perhaps genuinely convinced at last that George was too dangerous to live, moved against him. George was arrested, charged with treason, and condemned. And then, in the winter of 1478, on his brother the king's authority, he was put to death within the Tower of London, privately, without public execution, in a manner that gave rise to the famous legend that he was drowned in a barrel of sweet wine. Whatever the precise means, the fact was stark and irreversible. One of Cecily's sons had been killed on the order of another. The king had executed the duke, brother had destroyed brother, and Cecily, their mother, had to absorb the unbearable knowledge that one of her boys had put another to death. She had lost a husband and a son to her enemies on the battlefield. Now she had lost a son to his own brother, killed not by Lancastrians or rivals, but by her own family in the very heart of the House of York. It was a grief of a wholly different and more dreadful kind, and it struck at the deepest place a mother can be struck. There is reason to believe that Cecily fought to save George even at the last, and the picture of that final intercession is among the most poignant in her story. As her son, the king moved against her son, the duke, condemning George to death for his treasons. She is thought to have pleaded for the condemned man's life, throwing whatever weight a mother possessed against the machinery of royal justice. It was the natural act of a mother, to beg one son to spare another, and it was, in the end, unavailing. Whether because George's offences had at last passed all forgiveness, or because Edward judged him simply too dangerous to live, the king would not be moved, and the sentence was carried out. The episode shows her, in the cruelest of the roles her life forced upon her. Not the proud matriarch or the devout widow, but the desperate mother, interceding for the life of one child with another, and failing. There is a particular helplessness in it that cuts against the whole image of her power and consequence. For all her rank, her wealth, her influence, her royal blood, she could not save her son from his brother. The mother of the king and the duke could not prevent the king from killing the duke. It is a stark reminder of the limits of even her high position, and of the peculiar powerlessness that could attend a woman in a world where the final decisions of life and death belonged to men and to kings. She pleaded, and she lost, and George died, and she had to live with the knowledge that her plea had not been enough. There is a particular cruelty reserved for those who live long enough to watch their children destroy one another, and Cecily drank that cup to the dregs. Most parents who suffer the loss of a child lose them to illness or accident, or the ordinary hazards of a dangerous world, and grievous as such losses are, they carry no element of fratricide. No horror of one child destroying a brother. Her grief was of a darker kind. She had borne her sons, raised them, loved them, and then watched, helpless, as the bonds between them frayed and snapped and turned at last to deadly violence. One brother condemning the other, one of her boys sending him to his death within the tower walls. To lose a son is terrible. To lose a son at the hand of another son is a torment that strikes at the very root of what a family is. A perversion of the natural order, so complete that it can scarcely be borne. And she had to bear it not as a distant tragedy, but as the act of her own children, the killing done by one she loved against another. She loved, with no enemy to blame, and no comfort to be had. She could not even mourn cleanly, for the one who had died at the hand of the one who lived. And to grieve the dead was, in a sense, to reproach the living. It was the cruelest knot the wars ever tied for her, crueler in its way than Wakefield, for the enemy at Wakefield had at least been an enemy. Here the enemy was her own son, and the victim was her own son. And the mother who loved them both could only endure, in silence, a grief that had no clean shape and no possible consolation. It was in the years around the death of Clarence, as she entered her 60s, that Cecily turned ever more decisively away from the world and toward God, withdrawing into a life of devotion at her castle of Berkhamsted that would occupy the remainder of her days. The grief and bloodshed of her family's history may have driven her toward it. Age and the natural turning of a pious mind toward eternity surely played their part, and there was, perhaps, simply less for her to do in the world as a new generation took the stage. Whatever the causes, she made of her later life something remarkable, ordering her days at Berkhamsted around a rule of devotion so rigorous that it resembled the life of a nun more than that of a worldly lady. A surviving account of her household routine describes a day given over almost entirely to prayer and religious observance, beginning before dawn and structured around the canonical hours of the church, with masses and devotions and readings filling the time that other nobles gave to hunting and feasting and the pursuit of pleasure. She rose early, prayed at length, attended multiple services, listened to devotional reading during her meals, and ordered the whole shape of her day toward the worship of God. It was the regimen of a woman in deadly earnest about her faith, a discipline freely chosen and rigorously kept, and it gives us a portrait of she in age that is at once austere and strangely magnificent. The proud Duchess who had nearly been a queen, now living like a holy woman behind the walls of her castle. The discipline she imposed on herself in these years can be hard for a modern mind to grasp, accustomed as we are to thinking of retirement as a release from duty rather than a taking up of it. But Cecily's withdrawal was not a relaxation. It was a rule, a self-imposed regimen, as demanding in its way as any she had followed in the world. Rising in the small hours for the first office of the day, hearing multiple masses, reading and being read to from devout books, ordering every hour around prayer and contemplation. This was a labour undertaken with the seriousness of one who believed that the salvation of her soul depended on it. In an age of fervent faith, such a life was not eccentric, but admirable, the chosen path of many a noble widow who turned her remaining years toward God, and it carried its own prestige and its own deep satisfactions. For Cecily, who had spent her life in the exercise of will and discipline, there was perhaps a continuity in it as much as a change. She simply turned the same force of character that had governed estates and households toward the governance of her own soul. The fierce, proud, capable woman did not soften into vague piety in her old age. She took up the disciplined pursuit of holiness as a new and final field for the exercise of her formidable will, and she pursued it as she had pursued everything, with an iron seriousness that admitted no half measures. It was the last campaign of a lifelong campaigner, and she waged it on her knees. There is a temptation to see this turn to religion as a retreat, a withdrawal from a world that had given her too much pain, and there is surely something in that. Yet to read her piety as mere escape or defeat would be wrong, for in the thinking of her age, a life of devotion was no failure, but a high calling, perhaps the highest. And Cecily pursued it with the same force of will she had brought to everything else. Her religion was not a soft consolation, but a demanding vocation, undertaken with discipline and seriousness, an active shaping of her life toward holiness, rather than a passive sinking into pious gloom. And it was, in its way, entirely of a piece with the woman she had always been. The same pride that had made her insist on near-royal honours now expressed itself in a spiritual ambition to live as perfectly as a devout laywoman could. The same iron discipline that had carried her through war and grief now ordered her days around the offices of the church. She did nothing by halves, in faith as in everything else. The Berkhamsted years were not the fading of a once remarkable woman into irrelevance, but the final and characteristic expression of a powerful personality, turning the whole force of itself, at last, toward God. Proud Cis had become the devout Duchess, and the devotion was as grand and as serious and as wholly her own as the pride had ever been. Her devotion in these years went beyond private prayer into something close to a formal religious vocation. For Cecily is thought to have taken vows of the kind that allowed a pious widow to live, while remaining in the world, under a rule resembling that of a nun. Such a profession bound her to chastity and to a life ordered around prayer and the offices of the church, a recognized path by which a noblewoman might consecrate her widowhood to God without entering a convent. She maintained connections with the religious houses and devout communities of her day, supported them with her patronage, and modelled her own life on the disciplined devotion of the cloister. There was a long tradition of noble and royal widows turning in this way to a quasi-monastic life in their later years, and she followed it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, making of her widowhood not an idle waiting for death, but an active religious calling. The castle of Berkhamsted became, in effect, a kind of devout household monastery, ordered around its mistress's rule of prayer, its days shaped by the bells and offices of the church. It was a fitting culmination for a woman of her intense and serious faith, a way of giving form and purpose to the slow years of her survival. The proud Duchess, who had nearly been a queen, chose in the end to live as something near a nun, and there is no reason to think the choice anything but sincere. Having lost so much of the world, she gave what remained of her life to God, and did it with the same wholehearted seriousness she had given to everything else. The choice of Berkhamsted as the setting for this final phase of her life had its own quiet fitness. It was one of her dower properties, a castle that was hers by right, a place where she could establish her devout household on her own terms and live according to her own rule. There, removed from the bustle and danger of the court, but not so far as to be cut off from the affairs of the family, she created the ordered, prayerful existence that occupied her last years. The castle became a kind of private sanctuary, a household arranged entirely around its mistress's devotions, staffed by a household that served her religious life as much as her bodily needs. There is something deeply characteristic in the way she shaped even her retirement to her own design, making of her withdrawal not a passive fading, but an actively constructed life, ordered and disciplined and wholly under her own control. She had spent her years governing estates and households and influencing the affairs of a kingdom. Now she governed a smaller world, the world of her own devout establishment, with the same firm hand. Berkhamsted was her last domain, and she ruled it as she had ruled everything, with order, discipline, and an iron will, turned now toward holiness. The proud Duchess did not surrender her command in her old age. She simply narrowed its scope, from a noble enterprise to the governance of a single devout household and a single soul, her own. And over that small final kingdom she presided, serene and absolute, until the end. We catch a particularly vivid glimpse of the woman in these years through the books she owned and read, for Cecily was a woman of genuine learning and taste, and her library tells us much about the inner life behind the austere routine. She possessed a fine collection of devotional and improving works, the kind of books a serious and cultivated religious woman of her age would treasure. And the titles that have come down to us paint a portrait of her mind. She owned Lives of the Saints, those models of holy endurance and devotion that a pious noblewoman would read for inspiration and example. She owned works of mystical and contemplative religion, the writings of holy women and men who had sought a closer union with God, suggesting a spirituality of real depth and seriousness. And, strikingly, among them was a copy of a work by Christine de Pizan, a choice we will have cause to dwell on shortly, for it hints at a mind reaching beyond conventional piety. The books were read too, not merely owned for display. Her household routine included devotional reading aloud during meals, and the care with which she bequeathed her volumes at the end of her life shows how much they meant to her. Through her library we see past the formidable public figure to the inner woman learned, devout, reflective, drawn to models of holy women and to the defense of her own sex. A reader and a thinker, as well as a matriarch and a power in the land. The Rose of Raby and Proud Cis was also, it turns out, a woman of books. And that is not the least interesting thing about her. Her engagement with books places her within a wider and rather moving story about women and the written word in her age. Reading was one of the few spheres in which a noblewoman might exercise her mind freely, and devotional literature in particular was a realm where women were not only permitted but encouraged to be active, reading, owning, commissioning, and sharing the texts that nourished their faith. Great ladies built libraries, exchanged books, passed treasured volumes to their daughters and granddaughters, and through this quiet traffic in manuscripts sustained a culture of female piety and learning that ran alongside the male worlds of war and government from which they were largely barred. Cecily was a notable participant in this culture. The books she owned and read and bequeathed were part of a network of devout reading that linked the pious women of the high nobility, and her care for her library, the seriousness with which she chose and kept and passed on her volumes, marks her as a woman who valued the life of the mind. In an age that gave women little scope for public achievement, the world of books offered a space for inner development, for the cultivation of the soul and the intellect, and she made full use of it. What comes into view is a woman who was not only formidable and proud and devout, but genuinely cultivated, a reader and a thinker, who in the quiet of her later years found in her books a companionship and a sustenance that the bloody world of her menfolk could never have provided. It is one of the most appealing aspects of her, and one of the easiest to overlook behind the grand public figure. The particular choice of Christine de Pizan among her books is worth dwelling on, for it hints at a cast of mind more interesting than mere conventional piety. Christine de Pizan was a remarkable figure, a French writer of the generation before Cecily's, who had made her living by her pen and who had written, among much else, works defending women against the misogyny of her age and celebrating the achievements and capacities of her sex. For a noblewoman to own and read such a work suggests an interest in the questions of women's worth and women's place that went beyond the ordinary devotional reading of her station. We should not make too much of a single book in a library, otherwise full of saints' lives and works of devotion. But neither should we make too little of it. It is a small window onto a mind that may have reflected, in the deep quiet of its later years, on the position of women in a world that gave them so little scope, on the gap between the capacities of a woman like herself and the formal powerlessness to which her sex condemned her. Cecily had spent her life exercising real influence while being denied any formal authority, watching her sons wield the power she could only shape from behind. A woman in that position might well have found something to ponder in Christine de Pizan's defense of her sex. We cannot know what she made of it. But the presence of that book among her treasures is a tantalizing hint that the Rose of Raby, in her devout retirement, kept her mind alert to more than her prayers, and that she may have thought, in her own way, about what it meant to be a woman of power in a world made by and for men. The peace of Cecily's devout retirement was shattered in the spring of 1483 by a death that no one had foreseen and that would plunge the House of York into its final and most terrible crisis. Her son Edward IV, the king she had raised to the throne, the boy born at Ruan, who had grown into a giant and a monarch, died suddenly, not yet 41 years old, after a short illness that took everyone by surprise. He had reigned for the better part of 2 decades, had brought a measure of peace and prosperity to a kingdom exhausted by war, and seemed to have secured the future of his dynasty with a clutch of healthy children. His heir was his eldest son, a boy of 12, who would now become king as Edward V, under the protection of the family until he came of age. But a child on the throne could not rule alone, and whoever governed in his name would hold the true power, a prize worth fighting for, and the fight over it would rip the House of York apart from within. For Cecily at Berkhamsted, far from the centre of events, the news of her son's death must have come as both a personal grief and a premonition of danger. She had seen what happened when a kingdom passed to a child and the powerful men fell to fighting over the spoils. She had lived the whole bloody history of her age. Now, her dead son's throne was to pass to a 12-year-old grandson, and the man best placed to control that boy was her youngest and last surviving son, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. What followed would test Cecily's loyalties and her conscience as nothing in her life had done before. For her, the timing of Edward's death carried a special dread, because she of all people knew what happened when a kingdom passed to a child. She had lived the whole bloody history of the wars. She had seen how a weak or absent royal authority drew the powerful men into deadly competition. She had watched her own husband destroyed in the struggle for control of a feeble king's government. Now her grandson, a boy of 12, was to inherit a throne that grown men had killed and died for. And the question of who would govern in his name until he came of age was exactly the kind of question that in her experience got settled in blood. She would have understood the danger with a clarity born of bitter experience, and she would have known too that the man best placed to seize control of the boy and the realm was her own youngest son Richard. What she hoped for, what she feared, what she may have counselled in those first uncertain weeks, we cannot know, for she left no word of it, but she cannot have watched the unfolding crisis with anything but foreboding. She had buried a husband and 3 sons to the wars over the crown. Now the crown was passing to a child, and her last surviving son stood beside the throne with the power to take it. A woman of her experience would have smelled the danger in the air. Whether she sought to prevent what came, or aided it, or simply watched in dread, the foreboding must have been there. The old terrible pattern reasserting itself one final time in the twilight of her life. The grandsons whose fate now hung in the balance were, after all, her own descendants. And this is a dimension of the crisis easy to lose amid the high politics. The boy who was to be Edward V and his younger brother were the sons of her son Edward, her grandchildren. The next generation of the line she had laboured all her life to establish and secure. Whatever happened to them in the struggle over the throne would happen to her own blood. To children she had good reason to love and to wish protected, and the man whose ambition threatened them was also her own blood, her youngest son. Cecily was thus placed, in this final crisis, at the agonizing centre of a conflict between her descendants, her grandsons on one side, her son on the other, the throne between them, and herself bound by love and blood to both parties. There was no position she could take that would not be in some sense a betrayal of one part of her family for another. To support her grandsons was to oppose her son. To support her son was to abandon her grandsons. It was the cruelest of the many cruel binds her family's quarrels had placed her in, and it came at the very end of her life, when she might have hoped for peace. Whatever she did, or failed to do, in those terrible weeks, she did as a woman torn between her own descendants, with no choice available to her that did not involve the sacrifice of someone she had good reason to love. The wars had set her family against itself many times. Now they did it one last time, with she herself at the very heart of the division. However that terrible choice fell out, it is the final proof of a pattern that had run through Cecily's whole life, that the wars set her family against itself again and again, and that she, more than anyone, stood at the meeting point of its divisions. She was a Neville, married to a York, kin to both sides of the original quarrel. She watched her nephew Warwick make war on her son Edward. She saw her son Edward put her son George to death. And now she faced the prospect of her son Richard against her grandsons, the last and most intimate of all the family's self-inflicted wounds. Through each of these divisions, Cecily was the figure bound by blood to both parties, the mother or aunt or grandmother who could only watch as the people she loved destroyed one another. It was the particular curse of her position, the price of standing at the very centre of the family whose quarrels were the wars themselves. She had given her life to the House of York, and the House of York spent that life tearing itself apart, and she was there for all of it, loving both sides of every rupture. Neither. No one in the whole bloody story was more constantly placed at the heart of its divisions than she, Neville, and no one paid a higher price for it. She was the still centre of a family forever at war with itself, and she held that impossible position, with grief and with dignity, for the whole of her life. What Richard did in the weeks after his brother's death was to take the throne for himself, and the manner of his doing it struck directly at Cecily's own honour, moving with speed and ruthlessness. Richard secured custody of the young king and his younger brother, set aside the boy's claims, and within a remarkably short time had himself crowned as King Richard III. The legal pretext for this seizure was a claim that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that Edward had been pledged to another woman beforehand, making his marriage bigamous and his children illegitimate and barred from the throne. But there was a second and darker strand to the justification that was put about, and it is the strand that touched Cecily most cruelly. For alongside the claim that Edward's children were illegitimate ran a revival of the old Ruan slander, the suggestion that Edward himself had been a bastard, not truly the son of the Duke of York, and therefore never the rightful king at all. The woman who had given everything to the House of York now found her youngest son reaching for its throne by means that struck at her own honour, and the full cruelty of that will bear a closer look in a moment. She did not attend Richard's coronation. Whether that absence was protest, grief, distaste, or mere circumstance, the record does not say. But the silence is eloquent, and it sits at the heart of the central unanswered question of her life. Pause on the peculiar horror of what Richard's claim required, for it turned the weapon of slander against his own mother in the cruelest way imaginable. To set aside his brother's sons was one thing. To do it by reviving the old whisper that Edward himself had been a bastard was quite another. For that whisper could only mean one thing about Cecily. There was no way to call Edward illegitimate without calling his mother an adulteress. The legitimacy of a son rested entirely on the fidelity of his mother, and so to question Edward's birth was, unavoidably, to question Cecily's honour. To suggest that the proud and pious Duchess had betrayed her marriage with some unknown man and passed off the bastard as her husband's heir. That this slander should be revived of all people by another of her own sons, in his pursuit of the throne, gives the episode a quality of almost unbearable cruelty. Richard, to make himself king, was prepared to brand his mother an adulteress and his eldest brother a bastard, to wound Cecily's deepest honour in the service of his ambition. Whether he believed it, whether he cared, whether he gave a moment's thought to what it meant for his mother, we do not know. But Cecily knew, and had to live with it. The knowledge that her youngest son had taken the throne by a means that publicly dishonoured her, that called her chastity into question before the whole realm, that made her, in the official story of Richard's right to rule, a faithless wife. It was a betrayal folded inside an usurpation, and it was her own child who dealt it. For here we reach the deepest puzzle in Cecily's whole story, the question that historians have argued over, and that the surviving evidence simply will not settle. What did she think of Richard's seizure of the throne, and what part, if any, did she play in it? The possibilities run the whole range from victim to accomplice. At one extreme, she may have been horrified. A mother watching her youngest son brand her an adulteress and usurp the throne from her grandchildren, powerless to stop him and sickened by the means he used. At the other, some have wondered whether she was complicit, even an architect of Richard's accession. For there is a tantalizing scrap of evidence that Richard visited his mother at the crucial moment, and that some of the manoeuvring may have been coordinated from her London residence. Between these poles lie every shade of ambiguity: reluctant acquiescence, divided loyalty, a mother choosing her one surviving son over her dead son's children, or simply a powerless old woman swept along by events she could not control. The truth is that we do not know, and the record is too thin and too silent to tell us. Cecily left no statement of her feelings, took no clear public stand that survives, and carried whatever she knew and felt to her grave. It is one of the great frustrations of her story, and also, in a way, its fitting centre, the woman who kept her dignity and her secrets to the last, leaving us forever uncertain whether, in the darkest hour of her family's history, she was the chief victim or a quiet accomplice. The few hard facts we possess only deepen the mystery rather than resolving it. We know that Richard, in the crucial days when he was moving toward the throne, was lodged for a time at Baynard's Castle, his mother's London residence, and that some of the manoeuvring that led to his taking the crown seems to have been conducted from there. This has struck some as suggestive, for why would the usurpation be coordinated from the house of the very woman whose honour it impugned, unless she were in some sense party to it? Perhaps the argument runs: Cecily chose her last living son over her dead son's children, threw the weight of her house behind Richard's claim, and accepted even the slur on her own name as the price of seeing a son of hers keep the throne rather than a boy who would rule under the influence of the hated Woodvilles. Against this stands her conspicuous absence from Richard's coronation, and the sheer improbability that a woman of her fierce pride would willingly endorse a story that branded her an adulteress. The truth is that the evidence points in no single direction. The use of her house may mean she was complicit, or merely that Richard used his mother's London seat as a convenient base without her blessing, or anything in between. We are left, as so often with Cecily, peering into a silence she never broke. The one woman who knew exactly what she had done, and why, kept the knowledge to herself, and it died with her. The puzzle of Baynard's Castle is the puzzle of she entire, a tantalizing fact, an unbreakable silence, and a question that can be argued forever and never closed. It is worth asking how Cecily was regarded in her own lifetime, as distinct from the verdict of later ages, and the answer is revealing. To her contemporaries, she was a figure of immense dignity and consequence, the venerable mother of kings, treated with the deference owed to her blood and her position and her age. Whatever private resentments her pride may have stirred, she was not, in her own day, a hated or a notorious figure in the way that some royal women were. She attracted no great scandal, inspired no popular loathing, became the subject of no savage libels of the kind that pursued a Margaret of Anjou, or, later, an Elizabeth Woodville. She was, rather, a fixed point of respect, a grand old lady of the blood royal, whose long survival lent her a kind of monumental authority. Even those who had no love for the House of York could hardly deny the dignity of its matriarch, and as she passed into devout old age, that dignity only deepened, the proud Duchess becoming the revered and holy widow, whose prayers and good works commanded respect across the divisions of faction. It is a measure of how skillfully she navigated her dangerous world that she came through it all with her reputation, not merely intact, but enhanced, ending her life honoured by the very dynasty that had destroyed her house. In an age that was merciless to women who stepped wrong, Cecily kept her footing to the end and was esteemed, in her own time, as few women of such prominence ever managed to be. And there is a further horror folded into that dark hour, one that touched Cecily as a grandmother, even as the usurpation touched her as a mother. For the two boys whom Richard set aside, the sons of Edward IV, were Cecily's grandsons, the elder of them the boy briefly proclaimed king, the younger his small brother, and after Richard took the throne, that the two children were placed within the tower and by degrees seen less and less, until they were not seen at all. Their disappearance has tormented every generation since, the riddle that no amount of investigation has ever cracked. When the boys died, and how, and by whose command, or whether against all odds they died at all, remained genuinely unknown after 500 years. Suspicion has most often settled on their uncle, the new king, who held them and never showed them living to silence the rumours, but nothing has ever been established beyond doubt, and a careful telling must admit the question is still open. What concerns us here is what it meant for Cecily. Whatever she knew or suspected of Richard's part in the disappearance of her grandsons, she had to live with it. The knowledge that her youngest son had taken the throne over the bodies, or at least the vanished persons, of her son Edward's children, her own grandchildren. If she was complicit in Richard's rise, then she was implicated in their fate. If she was a horrified bystander, Then she watched one set of her descendants destroy another and could do nothing. Either way, the vanishing of the princes added another unbearable weight to the burden she already carried. The grandmother, whose grandsons disappeared into the tower at the hands, most likely, of her own son. It is one more of the silences she kept. One more of the horrors she absorbed and never spoke of in a life that had more than its share of both. Richard's reign was short, and its ending brought Cecily the strangest turn of all her strange fortunes. She outlived not only her husband and most of her children, but the very dynasty she had spent her life building. Richard III held the throne for barely 2 years before it was challenged by an invader from across the sea, Henry Tudor, in whom the beaten Lancastrian cause had invested its final hope, who came ashore with a slender force and a slender claim and gambled everything on battle. In the late summer of 1485, the two met at Bosworth, in the Midlands, and there Richard was killed. Cut down fighting as the support around him melted away, the final English king ever to fall in the fighting of a battle. With his death, the House of York, for which she had sacrificed so much, came to its end. The dynasty her husband had claimed and her son had won, and her youngest son had seized, was finished, swept away on a single afternoon, and the crown passed to a new family with whom she had no blood tie at all. Cecily, now 70 years old, had seen the whole arc of her life's work rise and fall, the long struggle to win the throne, the brief glory of 2 Yorkist kings, and now the total extinction of the line. Her last surviving son, dead on a battlefield like his father before him. She had outlived them all, husband, and the sons Edmund and George, and now Richard, and the daughters too in their time. The Rose of Raby had become the last supreme survivor of a vanished house. There is a grim arithmetic to her survival that bears stating plainly, for it measures the scale of what she endured. Cecily Neville outlived her husband by 35 years. She outlived her son Edmund, killed at 17, by more than 3 decades. She outlived her son Edward, the king, who died before her, though he was younger. She outlived her son George, executed by his brother. She outlived her son Richard, killed at Bosworth. She outlived her nephew Warwick, and most of her own generation of brothers and sisters, and very nearly all the companions of her youth and prime. A woman who lived to 80 in that age was a rarity. A woman who lived to 80, having buried a husband and at least 3 of her grown sons, 2 of them to violence and 1 to his own brother, was something stranger still. A survivor in the most literal and painful sense, left standing amid the wreckage of her own family. There is a particular loneliness reserved for those who outlive their children, and she knew it many times over. The longevity that we might count a blessing was, for her, also a kind of curse, condemning her to witness the deaths of nearly everyone she had loved and to carry the accumulated grief of decades. She was the last leaf on the tree, the one who remained when all the others had fallen, and she remained for a very long time, alone with her memories and her prayers and her God. And yet, in the final irony of her ironical life, the new dynasty that had destroyed her house was bound to her by the closest possible tie, for Henry Tudor took as his queen her granddaughter. To unite the warring claims and heal the long division, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Cecily's son Edward, Cecily's own granddaughter, the child of the king she had raised to the throne. So the blood of the House of York did not die at Bosworth after all. It flowed on into the new Tudor line through Elizabeth, and the children of that marriage would carry Cecily's blood forward into every English monarch who came after. The old Duchess, far from being cast out by the new regime, was treated with honour by it, for she was now the grandmother of the Queen, and a venerable link to the royal past. Henry VII confirmed her in her possessions and her dignity, and she lived out her last years in the same devout retirement, an honoured, if largely retired figure, the matriarch of a vanished dynasty whose blood ran in the veins of the new one. There is something fitting in this final reconciliation, this folding of the House of York into the House of Tudor, through the marriage of Cecily's granddaughter. The wars that had cost her so much ended at last in a union of the rival claims, and the line she had laboured to establish survived, transformed, in the dynasty that had replaced it. Cecily had lost the House of York, and kept, through her granddaughter, the future. The accommodation she reached with the Tudor regime in these final years required, one imagines, a certain swallowing of pride and grief, for Henry VII was the man whose victory had killed her last son and ended her house. Yet Cecily, ever the realist beneath the pride, made her peace with the new order, as she had made her peace with so much else. She had little choice. The House of York was finished, her last son dead, and the only future for her blood lay through her granddaughter's marriage to the conqueror. To have nursed open enmity against the regime, as her daughter Margaret did from the safety of Burgundy, would have been both futile and dangerous for a woman living out her days in England under the new king's eye. So Cecily accepted what could not be changed, was confirmed in her estates, and honoured as the grandmother of the Queen, and turned her remaining energies toward her God rather than toward a lost cause. There is a quiet wisdom in this, the same clear-eyed acceptance of hard reality that had carried her through so many reversals. She did not rage against the dying of her house or waste her last years in fruitless bitterness. She acknowledged the new world, secured what could be secured for her descendants, and gave the rest of her life to the preparation of her soul. It was the final expression of the practical good sense that had always run beneath her pride, the survivor's instinct to accept what is and make the best of it, even when what is includes the triumph of the man who killed your son. The dying embers of the Yorkist cause flickered on into Cecily's last years, in the form of the pretenders who troubled the early reign of Henry VII, and she would have watched their rise and fall from her retirement with what feelings we can only guess. Not everyone accepted that the House of York was finished. There were those who plotted against the new Tudor king in the name of the old dynasty, putting forward young men who claimed to be Yorkist princes, one impersonating a captive nephew of Cecily's, another claiming, astonishingly, to be one of the very princes who had vanished in the Tower, her own lost grandson, returned from the dead. These conspiracies drew support from die-hard Yorkists at home, and from Cecily's own daughter, Margaret, the Duchess of Burgundy, who from her court across the sea became the chief patroness of every plot against the Tudor regime, the implacable enemy of the dynasty that had destroyed her house. Cecily herself, old and retired and bound to the new order by her granddaughter's marriage, seems to have kept her distance from these intrigues, whatever her private sympathies. She had made her peace, however reluctantly, with the world as it now was, and the schemes of the irreconcilable Yorkists were the business of a younger and angrier generation. But it must have been strange and painful for her to watch. In her last years, the final convulsions of the cause she had given her life to, the pretenders rising in the name of a dead dynasty, her own daughter financing rebellion from abroad, the ghosts of the House of York refusing to lie quiet, even as the old matriarch prepared for her own end. The wars were over, but their echoes troubled her to the last. The end came in the spring of 1495, when Cecily was 80 years old, an age very few of her contemporaries ever reached, and a remarkable span for a woman who had lived through so much. In her last years she had remained the devout chatelaine of Berkhamsted, ordering her days around her prayers and her books, an old woman who had outlived her whole age and turned her face toward the next. She made her will at the beginning of April, a document that survives and that offers a final, moving portrait of the woman she had become. It is the will of a deeply pious soul, full of careful provision for prayers and religious bequests, mindful of the state of her soul and the keeping of her memory. And it is mindful, too, of the family that remained, for she remembered in it the reigning king, Henry VII, and her granddaughter the Queen, and her great-grandchildren, the little princes Arthur and Henry, in whom her blood and the future of the kingdom were joined. The woman who had begun her life as the youngest daughter of a northern earl ended it as the great-grandmother of the boy who would inherit England's throne, her bequests reaching forward to children who would carry her line into the 16th century and beyond. She died at Berkhamsted at the end of May, full of years and faith, and was carried to Fotheringhay, the great Yorkist family church, to be buried beside her husband Richard and her son Edmund, the man and the boy she had lost at Wakefield 35 years before. After a lifetime of partings, she was laid to rest beside the husband of her youth at last. A word should be said about her resting place, for it has its own story. Cecily was buried at Fotheringhay, the collegiate church that was the spiritual home of the House of York, laid beside her husband Richard and her son Edmund, whose remains had been brought there years before from their first hasty burial near the field of Wakefield. There the three of them lay together. The Duke, who had reached for a crown, the boy cut down at his side, and the Duchess who had survived them both by 35 years, a family reunited in death after all the partings of life. The tombs did not rest entirely undisturbed. In a later age, during the upheavals of the following century, the church at Fotheringhay fell into decay and the royal tombs were disturbed and rebuilt. The monuments we see today being later replacements rather than the originals. But the bones of she and her husband and her son remain there in the quiet Northamptonshire church, the heart of the vanished House of York. It is a fitting place for her to lie, this woman who had been so wholly defined by her family, at the centre of the house she had married into and helped to raise and outlived, beside the husband of her youth and the son she lost too soon, in the church where the white rose was honoured. After a life of almost ceaseless motion and almost ceaseless loss, she Neville came to rest at the heart of her family at last, and there, beneath the stones of Fotheringhay, she remains. There is a quiet symmetry in her burial that gathers up the whole shape of her life. She had been born a Neville, in the far north, the daughter of one mighty house. She had married into the House of York and given her life to its cause, and at the last she was laid to rest at Fotheringhay, the very heart of the house she had married into, beside the husband and the son she had lost long before. The girl from Raby ended, as the matriarch of York, buried at its spiritual home, her own Neville origins folded entirely into the family she had served. It is the resolution, in death, of the great fact of her life, that she belonged to two houses, born to one and wedded to another, and that her destiny lay with the house of her marriage rather than the house of her birth. The Nevilles had risen and fallen in their own right across these years. Her nephew, the Kingmaker, killed by her son's army, the family's power broken in the wars. But Cecily's fate was bound up, not with the Nevilles, but with the Yorks. And it was among the Yorks, at Fotheringhay, that she chose to lie. After 80 years of storm, the Rose of Raby came home, not to Raby, but to the family she had made her own, and there, beside her husband and her son, the long story of her loyalties reached its final and fitting rest. Her final years at Berkhamsted have a quality of quiet that is almost unsettling after the storms that went before, the deep peace of an old woman who had outlived her whole age. By the 1490s, she was a survivor among ghosts. The last of her generation, her husband more than 30 years dead, her sons all gone before her, her nephew the Kingmaker long since killed. The companions and rivals of her prime vanished one by one into the grave. She had seen the beginning of the wars and their end, had known the kings and queens and mighty lords of 3 generations, and had outlasted nearly all. There is something both serene and lonely in the image of her in these years. The venerable Duchess in her castle, ordering her days around her prayers, tended by her household, an honoured relic of a vanished age. The world that had formed her was gone. The cause she had served was finished. The family she had built had been swept up into a new dynasty that wore her blood but not her name. And yet she endured, calm and devout, neither bitter nor broken. A woman who had made her peace with God, if not entirely with the world. The fierce energies of her youth and middle age had been gathered, at the last, into the steady discipline of her faith, and she lived out her final years in the ordered tranquility of a soul, preparing, without fear, for its end. After 80 years of storm, the Rose of Raby came at last into a season of calm. It is worth trying to imagine the inner life of such a woman in such a season. Though the records give us little but the outward forms, she had lived through more history than almost anyone of her time born, while one king reigned, dying under a dynasty that had not even existed for most of her life, having known intimately the whole sweep of the wars that remade England. Her memory must have been a vast and crowded place, peopled with the dead, her husband as a young man, the children she had borne and buried, the triumphs and the catastrophes, the faces of kings and queens and mighty lords, long since gone to dust. What did she make of it all, in the quiet hours of her devotions at Berkhamsted? Did she find meaning in the providence she surely believed had shaped it? Reading her losses as the chastening hand of a God whose purposes she trusted even when she could not see them? Did she revisit the great decisions of her life, the choices made, and the roads not taken? The secret she carried about the darkest hour of her family's story? We cannot know. She left no memoir, no confession, no record of her reflections. But it is hard to believe that so intelligent and so reflective a woman did not, in those long years of prayer, turn over in her mind the extraordinary history she had lived, weighing it, grieving it, and at last, perhaps, making her peace with it before her God. The serenity of her final years suggests a soul that had in the end come to terms with all it had suffered, and that faced its own approaching end without fear. How, then, should she be remembered? Cecily Neville lived 80 years across the most violent and treacherous passage in English history, and she endured losses that would have broken almost anyone: a husband killed and his head crowned with paper, a son slain beside him, another son put to death by his own brother, a third son dead on a battlefield, and the dynasty she built with him extinguished. She was slandered in her own honour, her chastity made a weapon in her son's wars, her firstborn branded a bastard to serve a younger son's ambition, and through all of it she kept her head, her dignity, her faith, and her formidable self-command. Surviving when so many around her fell, enduring when endurance must have seemed beyond bearing. She was not a ruler, for her age did not permit women to rule, but she was a power and a presence and a matriarch of the first rank, the still centre around which the storms of her family revolved. And she was, in the end, the supreme survivor of her age, the one who outlasted them all, who saw the whole bloody story through from beginning to end, and who carried her secrets, including the greatest secret of all. Intact to her grave, there is one thing more to notice about her, and it is perhaps the most telling of all. Cecily Neville largely escaped the trap that caught nearly every other powerful woman of her age. The queens and kingmakers' wives around her, Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, and the rest were vilified by the chroniclers, painted as she-wolves and witches and grasping schemers, their power held against them, and their reputations blackened for centuries. Cecily, who was as proud and as powerful as any of them, somehow avoided that fate, coming down through history not as a monster, but as a venerable matriarch, the devout old Duchess, the mother of kings. Part of the reason is surely that she never quite held formal power in her own name, never ruled as a regent or reached openly for authority, and so never gave the chroniclers the target that an openly powerful woman presented. Part of it is the long pious dignity of her old age, which cast its serene light backward over the whole of her life. But part of it, one suspects, is exactly that quality of self-command and discretion that runs through her whole story. The woman who kept her own counsel, who never committed herself rashly, who carried her secrets to the grave. She gave her enemies little to work with, and history, in consequence, has treated her gently. She was, perhaps, the most successful of all the women of the Roses. Precisely because she was the most careful, and what she founded outlasted every loss. Through her surviving children and their descendants, Cecily Neville became the ancestress of a startling share of the royalty of England and of Europe. Her granddaughter Elizabeth of York was Queen of England and the mother of the Tudor line. Through that granddaughter, Cecily was the great-grandmother of Henry VIII and the great-great-grandmother of Elizabeth I, and the forebear of every English monarch who came after. Through her daughter Margaret's world of Burgundy and her other children's marriages, her blood reached into the nobility of the continent as well. The youngest daughter of a northern earl, born in a fortress on the edge of a wild country, became the fountainhead of dynasties, the grandmother and great-grandmother of kings and queens, whose names ring down the centuries. It is a destiny that no one watching that birth at Raby could possibly have imagined, and it is the final measure of her significance. She did not rule, she was barred from that by her sex. But she did something that outlasted any reign. She founded a line. The blood of the Rose of Raby flows down through the whole subsequent history of the English crown, and in that sense she triumphed over every loss her life dealt her. Her sons died, and her husband died, and her dynasty fell. But her blood went on, and goes on still. For a long time, indeed, history rather overlooked Cecily, and the reasons why are revealing in themselves. The chroniclers and historians of later ages were drawn to drama and to villainy. To the women who could be cast as she-wolves or schemers or victims, and Cecily, who fitted none of those moulds neatly, tended to slip through the net of their attention. She held no formal power to be condemned, fought no battles to be narrated, committed no crimes that could be proven, and ended her life in pious retirement rather than in some memorable catastrophe. The very qualities that had let her survive, her discretion, her self-command, her avoidance of the exposed positions that destroyed other women, also made her, to the storyteller's eye, less immediately gripping than the queens whose falls made better tales. And so she was often relegated to the margins, a name in the family tree, the mother of more famous sons, rather than a figure studied in her own right. It is only more recently that historians have turned their full attention to her and recognized what a remarkable figure she was. The survivor, the matriarch, the still center of the whole story. The woman whose long life spans and connects the entire bloody drama of the wars. The recovery of Cecily is part of a wider recovery of the women of her age. The recognition that the history of these events was not made by men alone. And that figures like Cecily, for all that they were barred from formal power, were central to the story in ways the older histories missed. She is, at last, being seen. Hold, finally, the full strangeness of the life she lived. For there can be few to match it. She was born in the reign of one king and died under a dynasty that had not existed for most of her years. She was the wife of a man who claimed a throne and died for the mother of two men who wore it, the grandmother of a queen. She knew the heights of fortune and its lowest depths, sometimes within a single year. She buried a husband and the better part of her children, saw her family rise to the summit of the kingdom and then be swept away, and lived on, serene, and devout, into a new age that wore her blood under another name. She kept her dignity through catastrophes that would have broken almost anyone, and she kept her secrets, including the greatest of them, to the very end. Not many lives have contained so much, or carried so much, or come to rest in such hard-won peace. The Rose of Raby, Proud Cis, the devout Duchess of Berkhamsted, the mother of kings, and the matriarch of a vanished house. She was all of these across 80 crowded years, and through it all, she was unmistakably herself, proud, formidable, faithful, and unbroken. The wars took nearly everything she had. They never took that, so let the room grow still now, and let her rest. Before we let her go entirely, hold in your mind one last image of her, the old woman at Berkhamsted, in the grey light before dawn, kneeling at her prayers as she had knelt every morning for years, the survivor of a vanished age, her husband and her sons long dead, her secrets locked within her blood already flowing on into the children who would rule the coming age. Soon she too would go to her rest, beside the husband of her youth, in the quiet church at Fotheringhay. The lamp is low now. The long quarrel is ended, the two roses joined, a new age rising, and the last noble lady of the House of York has come at last to her peace. If these slow journeys into far-off lives are something you would like to share again, you would be very welcome to subscribe. And the next will be here for you whenever a quiet hour is what you are looking for. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.